There is a particular kind of man who carries other people's futures in his coat pockets. He moves through rooms and conversations with an easy warmth, dispensing wisdom, offering comfort, making difficult things feel manageable. And because he seems so thoroughly present, so genuinely occupied with the person in front of him, almost no one thinks to ask what he is not saying. Almost no one wonders what he keeps folded away behind that patience, behind that knowing smile, behind the half-moon spectacles, and the deliberate lightness of tone. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore was that kind of man for the better part of a century. Headmaster, duelist, alchemist, friend, symbol. He was the figure the wizarding world turned toward when the darkness pressed close, and he never once gave them reason to doubt the solidity of what he offered. His judgment seemed sound because it usually was. His silences seemed like strategy because they usually were. And his decisions, even the ones that hurt people he cared about, seemed to come from a place beyond ordinary calculation, somewhere above fear, somewhere above personal interest. But Albus Dumbledore kept secrets his entire adult life, not small ones, the kind that decided the course of wars, the kind that shaped what happened to people who never knew he had made a choice about them. Some of those secrets were born from genuine calculation, considered carefully, and maintained with discipline. Others were born from shame so deep and so old that by the time Harry Potter arrived in his office, Dumbledore could no longer distinguish between the things he withheld for strategic reasons and the things he withheld because he simply could not bear to say them aloud. This is not the story of Dumbledore as the wizarding world knew him. This is the story of what he kept from that world. The summer in Godric's Hollow that turned a brilliant young man into someone permanently wary of his own desires. The sister whose life was built entirely around a secret the family maintained for years at great cost to themselves. The pact made between two teenage boys that prevented one of them from stopping a dark wizard for nearly half a century. The enchanted ring that Dumbledore put on his finger despite knowing it would kill him. The truth about Harry Potter that Dumbledore carried for 16 years without sharing it with a single other person, and the death that Dumbledore arranged for himself with the same methodical care he brought to everything else, a death designed to serve purposes he never fully explained to those left behind. So settle in tonight. Let the day's weight release from your shoulders, from the back of your neck, from your hands. The world outside is carrying on without you for a few hours. You have nowhere to be and nothing to decide. Tonight we follow Albus Dumbledore back through the parts of his life that history passed over, or that he made certain history would pass over, and we find that the man who spent decades dispensing wisdom to others spent those same decades carefully managing what wisdom he allowed anyone to have about him. We begin, as most things in this story begin, in the summer. Before we go further, if you have found your way to this channel tonight, and this is the first time you have settled in with us, welcome. If you enjoy what you hear, please consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell. It costs nothing. It helps this channel reach more people who are looking for exactly this, a calm voice and a long story to carry them into sleep. And if you have been here before, if this is night 2 or night 7 or night 30, leave a comment and let us know. We love knowing who is here with us. Now, back to Godric's Hollow and the summer of 1899. The village of Godric's Hollow sits in the west of England, neither large enough to be remarkable, nor small enough to be entirely forgotten. In the closing years of the 19th century, it was the sort of place where change arrived slowly, where the lanes between houses were still unpaved, where the church at the centre of the village had stood for 400 years and showed no signs of moving. Muggle residents and magical ones had lived there together for generations, each largely unaware of the other's precise nature, each assuming the other simply had unusual habits and letting the matter rest there. The Dumbledore family moved to Godric's Hollow when Albus was around 12 years old. They came not by choice exactly, but because the alternatives had been reduced to nothing. What happened before the move, what happened to Albus's father Percival, and what happened to his sister Ariana, we will come to in full detail. For now, the important thing is that by the summer of 1899, Albus Dumbledore was 17 years old and preparing to leave Hogwarts for the last time. He was not, by any account, an ordinary 17-year-old. His professors at Hogwarts had run out of superlatives somewhere around his 4th year. He read everything the library held on subjects that interested him, and then wrote to scholars outside Britain asking for more. His understanding of transfiguration exceeded that of most working wizards. His grasp of magical theory was unusual enough that older students asked him questions they could not get answered in class. Nicolas Flamel, at this point already several hundred years old and broadly considered the greatest alchemist in Europe, had corresponded with him. There were people in the wizarding world who expected Albus Dumbledore to become the greatest wizard of the age, and they said so without hedging. What they did not know, because Albus did not tell them, was that he planned to spend the summer in Godric's Hollow, taking care of his siblings, before setting off on a tour of Europe with his friend Elphius Doge. Ariana's condition required management. Aberforth was still young. Their mother Kendra had died earlier that year, leaving a gap in the household that nobody had quite figured out how to fill. Albus, as the eldest, was expected to step into it, and he knew he would, though the prospect of postponing the European adventure settled over him like something dense and grey. Then Gellert Grindelwald arrived. He came to spend the summer with his great-aunt Bathilda Bagshot, whose house stood within walking distance of the Dumbledore cottage. Bathilda was a historian of some renown in the wizarding world, the author of a history of magic, and her home was full of books and correspondence from scholars across Europe. Grindelwald had been expelled from Durmstrang several months earlier for conducting magical experiments deemed too dangerous even for that school, which was not known for its timidity. He was 17, like Albus. He was handsome, eloquent, fiercely intelligent, and he had spent the previous years developing a philosophy about the place of wizardkind in the broader world. They met, and within days, something shifted in the summer air of Godric's Hollow. Albus had never encountered anyone who could keep up with him before. Not his professors, not his classmates, not his correspondents abroad. Grindelwald matched him thought for thought, reference for reference, question for question. Their conversations began in the afternoon and ran past midnight. Bathilda later recalled hearing them talking through the walls, voices rising and falling, the occasional crack of magical energy when one of them demonstrated a theory. They moved through transfiguration and charms, and ancient languages and magical history, circling always toward the larger question underneath all of it: what should wizards do with the power they had? Grindelwald's answer was clear. He had been developing it for years. The International Statute of Secrecy, the law that kept the wizarding world hidden from muggles, was not a protection. It was a cage. Wizards possessed abilities that muggles could not match, and rather than hiding this, wizards should step forward and assume governance of the broader world, not as tyrants, but as benevolent guides. For the greater good, the phrase came easily to Grindelwald. It justified everything and questioned nothing. Albus heard this argument and felt something in him respond to it that he had not expected. He was brilliant, and he knew it. He had spent years performing modesty around people less capable than himself, filing his ambition into polite shapes. Grindelwald did not expect modesty. Grindelwald said, outright, that people of extraordinary ability had extraordinary obligations, and that pretending otherwise was not virtue, but waste. There was also something else between them that summer, something Albus acknowledged only decades later, in the aftermath of everything, when there was no longer any reason to pretend. He loved Gellert Grindelwald, not as a friend, not as an intellectual partner, though he was that as well. He loved him with the full and helpless clarity of first love, which always strikes hardest in people who have been too intelligent and too isolated to be softened before it arrives. Albus had spent his adolescence surrounded by people who admired him. Grindelwald was the first person who delighted in him. There is a difference between those two things, and it is the difference between being valued and being known. This love, which Albus never named aloud to anyone during Grindelwald's lifetime, coloured every part of that summer. The arguments felt electric, because they were doing two things at once, working out a philosophy and discovering each other. The plans they drew up together, for travelling the world after the summer, for studying the Deathly Hallows, for eventually rebuilding the relationship between wizards and muggles on terms of wizard dominance, carried the particular grandiosity of plans made by young people who have found someone who matches them and cannot yet imagine being wrong. But the summer was not a philosophical exercise taking place in a clean, separate space. There was a real house 30 yards away. There was Aberforth, 15 years old and already suspicious of the man his brother spent all his time with. And there was Ariana, who needed the kind of steady attention that a 17-year-old in love with his ideas and his new friend could not quite provide. This tension did not resolve itself cleanly. It ended in catastrophe. To understand the secret Albus Dumbledore kept about his sister, you need to understand what Ariana's life was like before the family came to Godric's Hollow. You need to understand what was behind the locked bedroom door, what her condition actually was, and why the Dumbledore family maintained such absolute silence about the true nature of what had happened to her. Ariana was 6 years old when 3 Muggle boys witnessed her performing magic in a garden in the village of Mold on the Wold. Magic, performed spontaneously by a small child who did not yet understand it fully, does not look like the controlled magic of an older witch or wizard. It looks strange, it looks wrong, it looks like something that should not be possible, and when young boys who do not understand what they are seeing encounter something like that, their reactions can be brutal. They tried to get her to do it again. She could not, or would not, and they hurt her for it. The precise nature of what happened is not something the historical record preserves. What is preserved is the aftermath. Ariana came home in a state of profound psychological damage. Her magic, which should have continued developing naturally through her childhood, had instead been fractured. It could not come out cleanly anymore. It came out in bursts, uncontrolled and explosive, triggered by emotional disturbance rather than intention. And because she could not control it, and because the expressions of it were violent and unpredictable, she had to be kept away from situations that might provoke it. Percival Dumbledore, her father, found the Muggle boys responsible and attacked them. He was arrested, tried, and sent to Azkaban. He never told the Ministry why he had done it. He told no one what had happened to Ariana, because to explain his actions would have been to expose his daughter's condition, and exposing that condition would have exposed her to a different kind of threat. The Ministry's response to a child with uncontrollable magic, magic that endangered those around her, was not gentle in that era. The likely outcome would have been institutionalization, which in wizarding terms meant something closer to imprisonment. Percival went to Azkaban, rather than allow that to happen. He died there, never having told anyone outside the family why he made that choice. Kendra Dumbledore moved her children to Godric's Hollow after Percival's imprisonment. She told neighbors that Ariana was ill, which was not exactly untrue. She maintained the fiction that her daughter was frail and sensitive, and not able to interact with the outside world. She devoted herself to managing Ariana's environment, keeping the household as calm as possible, avoiding situations that might trigger an episode. This required a level of vigilance that consumed most of her daily life. Now, there has been substantial discussion among those who have studied the history of the Dumbledore family about what, precisely, Ariana's condition was. The answer that fits the known evidence most closely is that she became what is known in the wizarding world as an obscurial. An obscurus is a parasite of magical energy. It develops inside a young witch or wizard who has been forced, through fear or trauma or external pressure, to suppress their own magic rather than express it. The suppression does not eliminate the magic. It compresses it, warps it, turns it inward until it becomes a dark, swirling mass of volatile energy that exists separately from the child's conscious control. Obscurials, the children who carry obscuruses, are typically considered unlikely to survive past their early teens. The pressure of containing that energy is simply too great for most bodies to bear long term. Ariana survived well into her late teens, which suggests her case may have been unusually stable, or that Kendra's careful management of her environment managed to prevent enough triggering episodes to extend her life. But the fundamental condition remained. The magic inside her was not something she could direct or express. It existed alongside her, dangerous and ungoverned, erupting when the emotional pressure became too intense, and returning to whatever uneasy stillness it could maintain between those episodes. Kendra never spoke about this publicly. Albus, when he took over management of the household in the summer of his graduation, understood the mechanics of what had happened to his sister, but understanding something medically and knowing how to live with it are different things. He had been at Hogwarts for 7 years, moving through a life of intellectual engagement and possibility, coming home to a cottage in Godric's Hollow, to a sister he could not fix, and a responsibility he could not delegate, required a kind of sustained surrender of his own plans that he was not, at 17, equipped to manage with grace. This is the context into which Grindelwald walked. Albus was already under pressure. already managing grief over his mother, already carrying the accumulated guilt of 7 years of absence. And then, suddenly, there was a brilliant young man in the village who wanted to talk about magic and philosophy and the future, who saw in Albus not a burdened eldest son, but a great mind waiting to be used, who offered, in exchange for the summer's attention, the intoxicating possibility that everything difficult was temporary, that the time of cages and sacrifices would eventually end, and that beyond it lay something magnificent. The secret Albus kept about Ariana for the rest of his life had 2 layers. The first was about her condition, which the family had hidden from the beginning. The second was about his own role in her fate, about what happened when the summer finally broke, and about the question that Albus carried to his own grave without ever answering. The summer ended as abruptly as it began. Aberforth Dumbledore, watching his brother spend all his time with Grindelwald, while Ariana remained increasingly unmanaged in the background, reached a breaking point. What he said to Albus has been recorded in the way these things always are, imperfectly, filtered through Aberforth's own telling of it decades later when he described it to Harry Potter in The Hog's Head. What it came down to was a direct confrontation. Albus, caught up in plans and philosophy and the pleasure of Grindelwald's company, was neglecting his sister, and the plans themselves, the vision of wizards ruling over muggles for the greater good, struck Aberforth as not only wrong, but dangerous, in a specific and personal way. What would the greater good mean for someone like Ariana, a girl whose condition marked her as damaged, as uncontrollable, as precisely the kind of person that efficient systems tend to discard? Albus, who had been hearing nothing but Grindelwald's ideas for weeks, reacted badly to being challenged, and Grindelwald, who had no patience for Aberforth and no reason to pretend otherwise, drew his wand. What followed was not a controlled duel. It was 3 young men in a small cottage, 2 of them furious and 1 of them frightened, performing magic without the kind of caution that might have kept the situation from escalating. Ariana, disturbed by the noise and the emotional upheaval in the room, lost whatever stability she had maintained through the summer. Her obscurus responded to the chaos the way it always responded to chaos. And then the magic ended, and Ariana was dead. Nobody knows with certainty whose spell killed her. Not Aberforth, who spent decades saying so. Not Grindelwald, who fled Godric's Hollow that same night and never returned. And not Albus, who knew only that when the magic stopped, his sister was on the floor, and that he could not say whether his own hand had been the cause. This is the most devastating secret Albus Dumbledore carried. Not the uncertainty alone, though that was terrible enough. The uncertainty combined with the cause. She was dead because of a fight that had started over him, because of a summer spent in the exciting company of a young man whose ideas had seduced Albus away from the responsibilities he should have kept, because Albus had wanted, badly, not to be the boy in the cottage with the damaged sister, and that wanting had made him careless. Grindelwald left. He continued developing his movement, building followers, experimenting with dark magic, eventually establishing himself as the most dangerous dark wizard in Europe. And Albus stayed in Godric's Hollow, and then eventually returned to Hogwarts as a professor, carrying the knowledge of that summer like a stone sealed inside his chest. For the rest of his life, Albus Dumbledore refused to be absolutely certain about the question of who had cast the fatal spell. He said this to people who asked. He acknowledged that he did not know. Aberforth said it too, and one of the choices Albus made, in the long aftermath of that night, was to never seek greater certainty, to leave the question open. Whether that was because he genuinely could not determine the answer, or because he preferred not to know, is itself a secret he took with him. What is certain is that the official account of Ariana's death, what the wizarding world knew, was almost nothing. She died young, during an unspecified magical incident. The family was private about it, and Albus Dumbledore, for the remainder of his life, referenced his sister's death only in the vaguest terms, framing it as a family tragedy he preferred not to discuss. He told Aberforth he was sorry. He told no one else anything at all. The shame of that night did something to Albus's relationship with his own desires. Before the summer of 1899, he had moved through the world with the easy confidence of someone who had never seriously doubted his own judgment. After it, he doubted it constantly, specifically when what he wanted and what seemed right occupied the same space. He had wanted Grindelwald's company. He had wanted to believe in the greater good. He had wanted, somewhere underneath all of it, to be the person Grindelwald saw, rather than the person Aberforth needed him to be. And that wanting had cost Ariana her life, so he built something around those desires. Not a cage exactly, but a caution, a habit of pausing between what he wanted and what he did, a practice of examining his own motivations with particular suspicion whenever they happened to align conveniently with what also seemed like the right course of action. He became, over the following decades, someone who trusted himself least when he trusted himself most. This quality would eventually become one of his greatest strengths, and it would also, in specific and painful ways, become one of his greatest failures. Between the summer of 1899 and the year 1945, Gellert Grindelwald built an empire. He began in Europe, gathering followers among witches and wizards who believed, as he did, that the relationship between the magical and muggle worlds could not hold. He acquired the Elder Wand, the most powerful wand ever created, from its previous owner by violence. He established the fortress of Nurmengard in Central Europe, a prison he built first to house his enemies, and which would eventually hold himself. He waged what amounted to a magical war across the continent, killing and coercing and drawing support from people who were frightened or idealistic or simply hungry for power, with a respectable philosophy attached to it. And Albus Dumbledore, during all of this, did not move against him. This is the fact that requires explaining. The man who later became the most celebrated defeater of dark wizardry in the modern age, who is credited with ending Grindelwald's reign in a duel described by those who witnessed it as the greatest magical combat of the 20th century, waited 46 years before he raised his wand against a man he had known since they were both 17. The wizarding world noticed. The British Ministry of Magic, in particular, pressured Dumbledore repeatedly during the 1930s and 1940s to act. He was, by general consensus, the only wizard alive who might be a match for Grindelwald, and he refused, year after year, to engage. He gave reasons. He told people he was not convinced the time was right. He told people that direct confrontation was not always the most effective strategy. He told people that his role at Hogwarts kept him occupied. None of these reasons were entirely false, and none of them were the real reason. The real reason was the Blood Pact. In the summer of 1899, at some point during those weeks of late-night conversations and shared philosophy, Albus and Gellert had made a pact. Not a verbal agreement, not a promise extracted under emotional pressure, but a formal magical binding. They had each taken a drop of their own blood and sealed it inside a crystal vial, creating an enchantment that prevented either of them from directly acting against the other. To raise a wand against Grindelwald, to strike him with any offensive magic of any kind, would violate the terms of the pact in a way that no act of will could override. The magic of the binding would respond before Albus could. He told no one this for decades. Not his colleagues at Hogwarts, not the ministry officials who pushed him to act, not the members of the Order of the Phoenix when it eventually formed. He maintained the fiction that his reluctance was strategic, or personal, or philosophical, and let the wizarding world draw its own conclusions about why the great Albus Dumbledore would not stop the dark wizard carving through Europe. Why did he keep this secret? Several reasons layered on top of each other. The most obvious was shame. To reveal the Blood Pact was to reveal the summer, was to reveal Grindelwald, was to explain why two teenage wizards had sealed themselves into magical binding together. The pact had not been made between adversaries. It had been made between people who believed, at the time, that they were on the same side. Explaining the pact meant explaining the relationship, and explaining the relationship meant exposing the love behind it, the shared ambitions behind that love, and the fact that Albus Dumbledore had once sat in a cottage planning the domination of the Muggle world, with the man now executing that domination, with considerably more violence than their teenage plans had imagined. There was also the practical matter of what revelation would accomplish. If Dumbledore admitted he was bound by a pact, it would not break the pact. It would simply make his paralysis official, and it would raise immediate questions about whether the pact could be broken, which would lead to efforts to break it, which might or might not succeed. Keeping the reason for his inaction private at least allowed Albus to maintain the appearance of choosing restraint rather than being compelled by it. Appearance, in this context, was not nothing. A visible symbol of resistance has value even when the symbol cannot act. A symbol that confesses it cannot act loses that value. So he waited, he taught, He did what he could from a distance, providing information to those working against Grindelwald's forces through other means, supporting resistance efforts without directly engaging. And in 1945, the pact was finally broken, in circumstances that were not of his making, by people who did not fully understand what they were dealing with. Once the binding no longer held him, Albus Dumbledore challenged Grindelwald to the duel that had been postponed for nearly half a century. He won. Grindelwald went to Nurmengard, the Elder Wand passed to its new master, and Dumbledore returned home and kept the secret of the Blood Pact still, because there was no longer any reason to reveal it, and every reason still to leave it buried. Here is something worth sitting with, in the quiet of this particular night. For 46 years, people in the wizarding world suffered under Grindelwald's expansion across Europe. Families were destroyed, magical communities were upended. The Muggle world went through its own version of catastrophe during the same period, and the relationship between those two catastrophes, the Muggle Second World War and Grindelwald's parallel campaign, is not something that magical history has ever examined with complete transparency. During all of it, the one wizard who might have ended it sooner was bound by a pact he had made as a teenager in love, and he chose to protect the secret of that love rather than explain why he could not act. He could have said, at any point, I am unable to move against Grindelwald because of a binding I created in my youth, and I need help finding a way to break it. He chose not to. Whether that choice was defensible depends on what you believe his actual reasons were. The shame explanation is real, but perhaps not sufficient. There may also have been something else beneath it, something that looked, in the dark and honest hours of Dumbledore's private life, more like the desire to be the one who faced Grindelwald when the moment finally came. A desire to settle that particular debt himself, in person, without delegation, which would mean that the 46 years of waiting contained, buried deep under the shame and the practical reasoning, a remnant of pride. Dumbledore took that question to his grave as well. In the winter of Harry Potter's first year at Hogwarts, Harry discovered a mirror in an empty classroom on the 3rd floor. The Mirror of Erised. The name came from the inscription along the top, which read, in reversed lettering, I show not your face but your heart's desire. Harry looked into it and saw his family, his dead parents standing behind him, his grandparents, cousins he had never met, a whole crowd of people with his eyes, or his hair, or his nose, all smiling at him. He went back to the mirror 2 more nights in succession. On the 3rd night, he arrived to find Albus Dumbledore already there, sitting in the shadows on a stone step, waiting. Dumbledore explained what the mirror was. He explained that men had wasted away before it, caught in the space between what was real and what was shown. He told Harry, with characteristic gentleness, that the mirror would be moved to a new home and that Harry should not go looking for it. Then, before the conversation ended, Harry asked the question that 12-year-olds ask and that most adults try not to be asked. What do you see when you look in it? Dumbledore smiled. He said he saw himself holding a pair of thick, woolen socks. The answer was so gentle, so perfectly calibrated to diffuse the question without quite lying to it, that Harry accepted it and the conversation moved on. And Dumbledore's actual answer remained a private matter, maintained as such for the rest of his life. He saw his sister alive and his family whole. Rowling has spoken to this directly. What Dumbledore saw in the mirror was not socks, or professional achievement, or the defeat of any particular dark wizard. It was Ariana, restored. It was the family he had when he was 12 years old, before the Muggle boys in the garden, before Percival's arrest, before Kendra's death, before the summer with Grindelwald, the version of life that never came to be. Why did he lie to Harry about this? There are several possible answers, and none of them cancel out the others. The simplest is that telling an 11-year-old boy that what you want most is the recovery of an impossible personal loss is not a useful exchange. Harry had his own grief to manage, his own mirror wound to process. Dumbledore's losses were not Harry's business, and making them Harry's business would not have served Harry or provided Dumbledore with anything except the small, temporary relief of having said something true to someone. The deeper answer is that the mirror showed Dumbledore something he had decided, long ago, he was not allowed to want. He had made his peace, or something that resembled peace, with Ariana's death. He had built a life from the rubble of that summer. To acknowledge publicly that the thing his heart returned to, when given perfect freedom, was the reversal of that night, was to acknowledge that the construction of his adult life had been built over a grief he had never fully processed, that underneath the wisdom and the calm and the institutional authority was a 47-year-old man who still wanted his sister back. That was not the image Dumbledore maintained of himself, or permitted others to maintain. He was the steady one. He was the one who moved through loss without being stopped by it. The mirror would have given the lie to all of that, and so he looked away from what it showed, kept it as his private knowledge, and answered Harry's question with a joke about socks. The joke was not meaningless. It was a form of deflection so practiced it had become second nature. He had been deflecting questions about his interior life for decades. "What do you see, Albus?" "A pair of socks." "Now let's talk about something useful." There is a way in which this particular secret, smaller than some of the others, illuminates all of them. The Mirror of Erised incident reveals something about how Dumbledore managed the relationship between what he felt and what he expressed. He was not, by nature, a dishonest person. He found untruth uncomfortable and avoided it where possible, which is why so many of his half-truths are genuinely half-truths rather than outright lies. He told Harry he saw socks and did not say it with the satisfaction of a complete lie. He said it with the quiet fluency of a man who had long practice at making his internal life unavailable to examination. This habit, which began in the immediate aftermath of the summer of 1899, became the fundamental architecture of how Albus Dumbledore related to the people around him for the rest of his life. He would tell them things. He would tell them true things, but the full picture would remain his alone, assembled only in whatever private space his thoughts occupied between the conversations. And if that meant some people made decisions without all the information they needed, he would work around it. He would adjust and compensate and manage the downstream effects. He had been doing exactly that since he was 17 years old. The Philosopher's Stone, in the winter of 1991, was not supposed to be at Hogwarts. Nicolas Flamel had possessed it for several centuries. He and his wife Perenelle had used it to produce the elixir of life, which they drank periodically to extend lifespans that would otherwise have ended centuries before. Flamel was somewhere north of 600 years old. The stone was his life's work and the means of his continued existence. But Dumbledore, who had worked with Flamel since the middle of the 20th century, convinced him to move the stone from Gringotts to Hogwarts in the autumn of 1991. He then arranged elaborate protections around it, the kind that a series of Hogwarts professors could each claim as their own contribution. A three-headed dog borrowed from Rubeus Hagrid, a series of obstacles including an enchanted chess game, a troll, a harp, a set of flying keys, and a potion riddle. At the end of all of these, a special enchantment that Dumbledore himself had placed on the mirror in the abandoned classroom. The enchantment on the mirror was both simple and brilliant. Only a person who wanted to find the stone, but not use it, could retrieve it from the mirror. Anyone who looked into the Mirror of Erised, hoping to use the stone to make gold or achieve immortality, would see themselves making gold and achieving immortality. They would never find the stone in their pocket. Only someone who wanted to find the stone and keep it safe would have the stone appear to them. It was, in isolation, an elegant piece of magical security. But the larger question, the one that Dumbledore did not draw attention to, is why the stone needed to be at Hogwarts at all. The answer requires connecting two things that Dumbledore understood and chose not to explain to anyone: the threat posed by Lord Voldemort and the situation of a particular 11-year-old boy who had just arrived at the school. Dumbledore knew, by the autumn of 1991, that Voldemort had not been destroyed by the curse that rebounded at Godric's Hollow 10 years earlier. The fragments of intelligence available to him, including reports of unusual occurrences in Albania, where Voldemort's disembodied spirit had been gradually stabilizing, made clear that something remained. He also knew that Quirinus Quirrell, the defense against the dark arts teacher Dumbledore had himself hired for that year, was compromised. Quirrell had encountered whatever remained of Voldemort during his travels and come back a different person, carrying his master in the back of his own skull, like an uninvited passenger. Dumbledore had evidence of this. He let Quirrell teach anyway. He let Quirrell teach, and he moved the Philosopher's Stone to Hogwarts, and he set up obstacles that a determined and clever student could get through with the right combination of skills. And Harry Potter arrived at Hogwarts that September, the son of the only man and woman who had ever survived Voldemort's killing curse, carrying in him a magical protection that Dumbledore was beginning, though not yet fully, to understand. The stone was bait, the obstacles were a test, and the enchantment on the mirror ensured that no one would get the stone who intended to use it, which meant that Quirrell, serving Voldemort's desire for immortality, could not retrieve it. But a child with no desire to use the stone, a child who only wanted to find it and keep it from the wrong hands, could retrieve it. And that child was already in the building. Dumbledore was not entirely present for the events of that June night. He was called away to London, apparently on ministry business, at precisely the moment things came to a head in the underground chamber. He returned to find Harry in the hospital wing, having confronted Quirrell, touched Voldemort, and survived through the same magical protection that had saved him at Godric's Hollow. How convenient the timing was. That is a thing worth noticing, without pressing it too hard. A headmaster who knows the stone is being sought, who knows his defense teacher is compromised, who has arranged the protection of the stone personally, is called away from the school at the critical moment, and returns to find the situation resolved. He told Harry, in the hospital wing, that Flamel and he had agreed to destroy the stone, that Flamel had enough elixir stored to set his affairs in order, that the stone's continued existence created more problems than it solved. He did not tell Harry that the stone had served its purpose, that the purpose had been, among other things, to create a situation in which a specific child could demonstrate specific abilities and prove something about the nature of his magical protection. He did not tell Harry that the whole arrangement had been a kind of test, as much as a defense. He did not tell Harry because Harry was 11, and because the information would have raised questions Dumbledore was not yet ready to answer. How much did you know? How long have you known it? What else are you not telling me? Instead, he gave Harry the truth in the limited quantity he had decided Harry could handle. The stone would be destroyed. Flamel would die eventually but peacefully. Voldemort had been delayed but not stopped. And yes, Albus knew Harry had questions about why Voldemort wanted to kill him specifically. And no, Albus did not think now was the right time to answer them. He smiled. He offered Harry a chocolate frog. He deflected with such warmth that the deflection was almost an act of affection. This pattern, established in Harry's first year, would repeat itself across the 6 years that followed with the consistency of something Dumbledore had decided on and stuck to, regardless of what the situation seemed to require. Severus Snape arrived at Hogwarts as a student in the autumn of 1971, the same year as James Potter, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew. He was a pale, thin boy from a difficult home in a northern English mill town, the son of a Muggle father who had no interest in the magical world, and a witch mother who had married down from a wizarding family with its own troubles. He arrived at Hogwarts with an extensive knowledge of dark arts spells he had taught himself and a social isolation that made him easy to mock and hard to befriend. He was brilliant. He excelled at potions with a facility that went beyond textbook knowledge, annotating his copy of advanced potion making with modifications and improvements that decades later would have Harry Potter, who inherited the same copy, performing considerably better than his peers without understanding why. He was talented at defense against the dark arts and at charms, less comfortable with transfiguration, but carrying himself in every class with the particular pride of someone who knows they are good at the thing and wants that acknowledged. What made his life at Hogwarts difficult was not his ability, it was everything else. He fell in with a group of students who were either Death Eaters in waiting or would become Death Eaters. He was sorted into Slytherin. He developed an enmity with James Potter and his friends that hardened into something more serious as the years went on. And he was in love, from the time they were children sharing a street in Cokeworth, with Lily Evans. Lily, who was bright and warm and kind in ways that made everything else in Snape's life feel harder by contrast. Lily, who was Muggle-born, and therefore the kind of person that Snape's new Slytherin friends considered inferior. Lily, who eventually stopped speaking to him after he called her, in a moment of humiliated rage, the word that the wizarding world used for Muggle-born witches, the way a slur is used anywhere, to diminish, to wound. He lost her. He graduated. He became a Death Eater. He became what the company he had been keeping since 5th year had been preparing him to be, which is one of the saddest things in the entire history of that era, if you follow it clearly. And then he heard part of a prophecy. In the Hog's Head, in the early months of 1980, Albus Dumbledore was interviewing Sybil Trelawney for the position of divination professor. Trelawney, whose psychic predictions were generally unreliable at best and performative at worst, went into a genuine trance partway through the interview and delivered something that was not a performance. It was an actual prophecy. The prophecy described a child, born as the 7th month died, to parents who had thrice defied Lord Voldemort. It said this child would have a power the Dark Lord knew nothing of, and it said that either the one with this power must die at the hand of the other, or that neither could live while the other survived. Severus Snape was outside the door. He had come on Voldemort's behalf, alert to any information that might prove useful. He heard the first part of the prophecy before the proprietor of the Hog's Head discovered him and threw him out. He did not hear all of it. He heard enough. He carried what he had heard directly to Voldemort. At this point, 2 families fit the prophecy's description, the Potters and the Longbottoms. Voldemort chose the Potters, apparently because Harry had abilities that reminded him more of himself. He set out to kill James and Lily and their infant son, and then Snape, who had brought him the information that led to this decision, learned that the target was the family of the woman he had never stopped loving. He went to Dumbledore. This is the central fact of everything that follows. Severus Snape, active Death Eater, supporter of the man who had killed and tortured and broken everything Snape's moral education should have stood against, walked to Albus Dumbledore and told him everything because he wanted Lily protected. Dumbledore heard him out. Then he asked Snape, with the particular quietness of someone who already knows the answer but wants it said aloud, would he give anything to protect her? And Snape said yes. The arrangement that followed was total. Snape would become a double agent. He would return to Voldemort's service, maintaining his position as a Death Eater, in good standing, while feeding information to Dumbledore. When Voldemort fell, which Dumbledore believed would happen, though he could not yet say how, Snape would continue at Hogwarts. He would be Dumbledore's man, unknown to everyone else on both sides. In exchange for what? In exchange for the protection Dumbledore promised to extend to Lily Potter, a promise that was, in the event, insufficient. Lily died. James died. Harry survived, and Snape was left with nothing he had bargained for except the secret arrangement with Dumbledore, which was now the whole of his existence. Dumbledore, in the years that followed, continued to keep Snape's true allegiance hidden, not because the information was not relevant to the people working alongside Snape, but because revealing it would have compromised the double-agent arrangement that Dumbledore believed remained necessary. He told the Order of the Phoenix that Snape was trustworthy. He did not tell them why he believed this, because why he believed it was the secret itself. He told Harry, who despised Snape from their first meeting in potions, and who had good reasons for that despising, only that Snape was to be trusted. He said this repeatedly, in varying tones of patience, without ever producing the reasoning that would have made the instruction comprehensible. He knew, and chose, that Harry's inability to understand why he should trust Snape would be the source of active harm over the years that followed. He accepted that as a cost. The arrangement between Dumbledore and Snape also included something else that Dumbledore did not share with anyone. When Dumbledore's hand was cursed by the Resurrection Stone in the summer of 1996, and Snape's skill in containing the curse gave Dumbledore perhaps a year of additional life before the curse would claim him, Dumbledore asked Snape for something more. He told Snape that Draco Malfoy had been tasked with killing him, and that Draco would almost certainly fail, but might damage himself irreparably in the attempt. He told Snape that when the moment came, Snape must be the one to kill him. Snape must kill the headmaster, in front of witnesses, if necessary. He must appear to kill him with conviction, making the act believable enough that Voldemort would accept it, and Snape's position as trusted Death Eater would be secured. And then, after Dumbledore was gone, Snape must find a way to protect the students of Hogwarts, while appearing loyal to the regime that Voldemort would install, and then find the right moment to pass a final message to Harry Potter about what Harry was, and what Harry had to do. This was what Dumbledore asked of Severus Snape in the summer of 1996. He asked him to commit the appearance of murder in front of witnesses. He asked him to go through the years that followed as the man who had killed the greatest headmaster Hogwarts had known, despised by every former colleague, unable to explain himself, maintaining a pretense that would be indistinguishable from the real thing to anyone watching. He asked him to do this and survive it, and then deliver one final piece of information at exactly the right time, and Snape agreed. Nobody knew any of this. Not Minerva McGonagall, who watched Snape appear to murder Dumbledore on the astronomy tower and spent the next year believing it with the full weight of her grief. Not Harry Potter, who spent that same year believing that Snape was the most contemptible person he had ever encountered. Not the members of the Order of the Phoenix, who had worked alongside Snape for years and now believed, in the most literal possible sense, that he had betrayed everything. Dumbledore took this secret with him to his death. He left Snape to carry it alone. There is a story that wizarding children learn at bedtime, told to them by their parents the way Muggle children are told about giants who live above the clouds and wolves who dress up as grandmothers. It is called The Tale of the Three Brothers. Three brothers, it says, meet death on a bridge at midnight. Death, cheated by their cleverness, offers each a gift. The eldest asks for the most powerful wand ever made. The second asks for something to bring the dead back to life. The youngest asks simply for a cloak that will hide him from death itself, and he hides under it until he is old and peaceful and ready, and then he greets death as an old friend. The story is told to children as a moral fable, a reminder that wisdom lies not in the conquest of death, but in the acceptance of it. What children are not told, because most wizarding adults do not know, is that the three gifts in the story are real objects. The Elder Wand exists, having passed from master to master for centuries through violence. The Resurrection Stone exists, and the Cloak of Invisibility, the one that has been handed down through one specific line of descent for 300 years, exists, and is currently in the possession of the Potter family. Albus Dumbledore knew all three things. He knew because as a boy, he had been obsessed with proving them. The summer with Grindelwald was not only about power and philosophy and young love. A significant portion of their conversations concerned the Deathly Hallows. Both young men were convinced, based on their respective research, that the three objects were real. Both were equally convinced that uniting all three, becoming the so-called Master of Death, was not only possible but worth pursuing. Grindelwald's obsession with the Elder Wand dated from this period. So did Dumbledore's. After the summer ended, after Ariana died and Grindelwald fled, Albus set aside the explicit pursuit of the Hallows. He returned to Hogwarts eventually, taught, built his professional reputation, and became the person the wizarding world came to know. But the knowledge of the Hallows remained, catalogued and preserved in whatever part of his mind he kept the things he was not actively thinking about. James Potter's invisibility cloak came to Dumbledore's attention through a chain of circumstances in the months before Voldemort fell. He asked James if he could borrow it for a while. James agreed, and Dumbledore held the Cloak of Invisibility, one of the three Deathly Hallows, while the people at Godric's Hollow had no invisible cloak to hide them when Voldemort came. This has been noted by those who have examined the timeline with care. Whether Dumbledore should have returned the cloak before October of 1981 is a question that does not have a clean answer. What happened to the Elder Wand has already been touched on. Dumbledore won it from Grindelwald in 1945. He kept it for the remainder of his life, wielding it with great care, and never using it for the kind of political domination that Grindelwald had imagined it enabling. He had learned, by that point, to be suspicious of what he wanted the wand to allow him to do. The Resurrection Stone is a different story, and one of the most painful ones in all of this. The Resurrection Stone was embedded in the Gaunt family's ring. Marvolo Gaunt, Voldemort's maternal grandfather, wore it on his finger. His son Morphin had it at some point. Voldemort took it, turned it into a Horcrux by placing a fragment of his soul inside it, and set it in a ring that he hid in the ruined Gaunt shack near Little Hangleton. Dumbledore, in the summer of 1996, tracked the ring to the shack. He found it. He knew it was a Horcrux. He knew the ring itself was cursed with a particularly dark piece of magic. He knew, as one of the most knowledgeable wizards alive, that placing a cursed Horcrux on his finger, without first removing the curse, was going to harm him severely. He put the ring on anyway. He put it on because the Resurrection Stone was set into the ring, and the Resurrection Stone could bring back the dead, not truly, not in the way the story suggests, not as whole living people who return entirely to themselves, but enough, as shadows, as reflections of the dead, shaped by the knowledge of those who summon them. And in the moment he saw the ring, Dumbledore thought of Ariana. He wanted to see her again. He wanted to speak to her and say the things that had accumulated over 90 years of not being able to say them. He wanted, one more time, the specific comfort of her presence, however reduced from life it would necessarily be. This is what happened to one of the most controlled and self-aware wizards of his generation, when he was confronted with the object that promised what he most secretly desired. He put it on before he thought it through. The curse spread up his arm before Snape could stop it entirely. Snape's skill contained it and slowed it, but could not reverse it. The curse would kill Dumbledore. The question was only when. The best estimate, after Snape had done what he could, was approximately 1 year. Dumbledore told no one else. He told Snape, because Snape had to understand the timeline to understand the plan. He made the necessary adjustments to what he had already been planning, and he went on running Hogwarts, meeting with Harry for lessons in Voldemort's history, managing the Order of the Phoenix, and keeping the countdown of his own death strictly private. The Resurrection Stone, once he had recovered from the immediate shock of the curse's effect, he placed inside the snitch. What Harry's first golden snitch contained, sealed inside its golden shell, was not a good luck charm. It was the stone that the second brother had used to call back the dead from Shadow. Dumbledore placed it there because he believed Harry would need it. In the forest, at the end, he left it to Harry in his will and said nothing about what it actually was. He left Harry the stone that could summon the dead, and he left Harry to figure out the rest. If you are still with us tonight, still settled into the dark and the quiet, thank you for being here. If this channel has become part of your sleep routine, please consider leaving a comment below. It takes a moment, and it means a great deal to know who is listening, and if you have not yet subscribed, this would be the right time. New videos come out regularly, always long, always calm, always something to carry you through the night. Turn on that notification bell so you do not miss one. Now, we have reached the center of all of this, and there are secrets still to go that are even larger than the ones we have covered so far. Albus Dumbledore first began to suspect the truth about Harry Potter in the years following Voldemort's return in 1994. He suspected it was possible, theoretically, as early as the autumn of 1991, when he first studied the nature of the magical protection that had kept Harry alive. But suspicion and certainty are different things, and even as the picture clarified over the following years, Dumbledore sat with what he was increasingly sure of, and did not tell Harry. What he was increasingly sure of was this. When Voldemort's killing curse rebounded at Godric's Hollow in 1981, striking Harry rather than its intended target, something happened to Voldemort's soul that should not have been possible under normal circumstances. Voldemort had already, by that point, fractured his own soul multiple times by committing deliberate murder and using the act of murder to create Horcruxes, the split-off fragments of soul sealed inside objects. His soul was, by the time he faced Harry, already in a state of extraordinary damage. When the curse rebounded, the impact destroyed Voldemort's body and his grip on life, but it also fragmented his soul one more time, because his soul was too unstable to sustain the shock without splitting again. The fragment that split off did not have a vessel waiting for it, no prepared container, no enchanted object, nothing Voldemort had selected and readied in the way he had with the diary, and the ring, and the locket, and the cup, and the diadem, and Nagini. The only available vessel was the child in the crib. The fragment of Voldemort's soul attached itself to Harry Potter in the moment of the curse's rebound. Not because Voldemort intended it, not because Harry was chosen for it in any mystical sense, but because the soul fragment had nowhere else to go, and Harry was there, and the connection between them had already been established by the act of the curse finding its target. Harry became, without either of their knowledge or consent, a Horcrux. This meant that as long as that fragment of soul survived inside Harry, Voldemort could not be truly killed. One of Voldemort's Horcruxes would remain active, tethered to life inside a living person, and it meant something else that Dumbledore had to sit with for years before he fully worked out what to do about it. Harry would have to die. Not permanently. Dumbledore was fairly certain, by the time he had thought through all the details, that killing the Horcrux inside Harry would not necessarily kill Harry himself. This certainty rested on several interlocking pieces of reasoning. Voldemort, in rebuilding his body in 1994, had used Harry's blood as one of the components. This meant that Voldemort had taken into himself the magical protection that Lily Potter's sacrifice had embedded in Harry. Voldemort was now the thing that kept Harry's protection alive in a physical sense, which meant that while Voldemort remained alive, Harry retained the magical protection that had saved him once before. If Harry was struck by a killing curse in that state, the Horcrux inside him would be destroyed, but Harry himself would survive. This reasoning required the killing curse to be cast by Voldemort specifically, because only Voldemort carried Lily's protection inside him in the necessary way. It required Harry to go willingly to his death, and it required Harry to not defend himself, because a wizard who died fighting would trigger different magical mechanics than a wizard who surrendered completely. Dumbledore planned all of this. He understood it clearly by at least the end of Harry's 6th year, and possibly earlier. He set up the lesson series in Harry's 6th year, not only to educate Harry about the Horcruxes in general, but to bring Harry to the state of understanding and trust that would make him willing to follow the final instruction when it came. He sent Harry on the hunt for the remaining Horcruxes, knowing that the last Horcrux to be dealt with, the one that could not be found or held or destroyed by conventional means, was walking around attending classes and playing Quidditch and eating meals in the Great Hall. He never told Harry this. He decided, and the decision is one of the most morally complex in this entire story, that if Harry knew he was the 7th Horcrux, Harry would be unable to function in the way Dumbledore needed him to function. He might refuse to accept his own death when the time came, seeking instead to find some other way to destroy the fragment. Or he might accept it too early and sacrifice himself before the other Horcruxes had been dealt with, which would accomplish nothing. Or, perhaps most likely, he might simply be unable to carry the weight of that knowledge through the years of searching and hiding and fighting. The plan required Harry to be Harry, responsive, courageous, willing to sacrifice himself for others, but not yet knowing the specific nature of the sacrifice until the last possible moment. So Dumbledore kept it. He kept it through Harry's 6th year, letting Harry go through those lessons, believing the task was finding and destroying objects. He kept it after his own death, passing the information to Snape in the form of a memory staged inside the pensieve, specifically so Snape could show it to Harry at the critical moment. He kept it through everything, and then he left Snape to be the one who broke it. And Snape, in the hour before the Battle of Hogwarts, dying from a snake bite in the Shrieking Shack, gave Harry a collection of his own memories, because Dumbledore had placed the information there years earlier, knowing Snape would be the one to deliver it. Harry went into the pensieve, saw what Dumbledore had prepared for him to see, and walked out of the Shrieking Shack, carrying the knowledge that he had to go to Voldemort and allow himself to be killed. He walked into the forest. He opened the snitch that had been waiting for him since his 1st year. The resurrection stone inside it called his dead family around him as he walked, and he died, or nearly died, and came back and ended the war. The plan worked. Whether the plan was right is a question that has no consensus answer. Whether Dumbledore was justified in keeping Harry ignorant of his own nature for 16 years, in the name of a plan that depended on that ignorance, is exactly the kind of question that falls into the space where most people's honest analysis fails them, because the outcome was good. Harry survived. Voldemort fell. The plan worked. But it required Harry to walk into the forest alone, believing he was going to die, without the years of preparation that people given advance warning of their deaths are generally permitted to have. It required Harry to trust Dumbledore completely and posthumously, on the basis of a memory delivered by a man Harry had spent a year believing was his greatest enemy. It required a 17-year-old boy to make the ultimate decision, with approximately 2 hours of forewarning. Dumbledore believed Harry was capable of this. He was right. But it is worth spending time in the space of what it cost Harry to be right, in the way Dumbledore needed him to be. Most people in the wizarding world knew that Albus Dumbledore had defeated Gellert Grindelwald in 1945. Most people knew that this duel was considered the greatest display of magical combat seen in the modern era. What almost nobody knew, in the years between 1945 and the end of Voldemort's 2nd reign, was the practical implication of that victory. The Elder Wand had a master. It had always had a master. The wand's nature, which wizarding scholars had studied and debated for centuries, was to give its full power to the one who had won it. It could be won by killing the previous master, but it could also be won by disarming them, by besting them in magical combat, without the fatal step. It transferred allegiance not through death, but through defeat. And after Dumbledore defeated Grindelwald in 1945, the Elder Wand was Dumbledore's. He kept this largely to himself. He used the wand, performing magic of extraordinary precision and power, but he did not announce its significance. He did not say, publicly, that he had won the Deathly Hallow from Grindelwald and now wielded the most powerful wand ever made. He kept the wand's identity private, and most people who knew him well assumed he was simply an extraordinarily talented wizard whose skill accounted for his power. Very few suspected it was also the wand. By the time Dumbledore's death became imminent, he had worked out a plan for what should happen to the Elder Wand when he died. He intended for the wand's allegiance to die with him. If he could be killed while he held the wand, by someone he chose and in circumstances he controlled, the wand would have no new master. Its line of succession would end. The cycle of violence surrounding the Elder Wand, the long history of people killing each other to possess it, would close. The plan required his death to occur in a specific way. He had to be killed by Snape, whom he trusted, who would take the wand from his body but would not thereby win mastery of it, because winning mastery required the disarming or defeating of its master, rather than the killing of someone already dying of a curse. Dumbledore, in the moment of his death, would already be effectively beaten by the curse that was claiming him. Snape killing him would be an act of mercy toward a dying man, not the conquest of a wizard still at his full strength. The wand would not transfer its allegiance. He almost got this right. He nearly got it precisely correct. What he did not account for was Draco Malfoy. In the moments before Snape arrived on the astronomy tower, Draco Malfoy had cornered Dumbledore alone, wand raised, unable to make himself complete the act he had been assigned. And Dumbledore, who was already weakened from the cave and the Horcrux's defenses, had allowed Malfoy to disarm him, not because he could not prevent it. He could have prevented it. He chose not to. He chose not to disarm Malfoy because he was working multiple objectives at once, as he always was. He wanted Malfoy to feel, in that moment, that he had won. He wanted Malfoy to have the experience of having the upper hand against Albus Dumbledore without being required to do the killing, which would have cost Malfoy something permanent. And he wanted to demonstrate to the Death Eaters who arrived moments later that Draco was capable of completing the task, so Draco's failure to actually complete it would not result in Draco being punished by Voldemort as harshly as it otherwise would have been. But the result of Draco disarming Dumbledore was that the Elder Wand, in the logic of its own nature, transferred its allegiance. The wand's master had been disarmed. Draco Malfoy, who did not know what he had just done and had no idea the wand was the Elder Wand, became the master of the most powerful wand ever created. Dumbledore did not know this had happened. He died moments later, knowing the wand's plan, but not knowing the wand's plan had already been disrupted. Voldemort, in the following year, broke into Dumbledore's tomb at Hogwarts and took the Elder Wand from his dead hands. He believed this would make him its master, but mastery of the Elder Wand had already passed through Draco Malfoy, and then, in the room of requirement at Malfoy Manor, when Harry seized Draco's own wand by force, had passed again. The Elder Wand's true master, by the time Voldemort raised it against Harry in the Great Hall, was Harry Potter. The wand refused to kill its master. The curse rebounded. Dumbledore's plan for the Elder Wand, for the wand to die with him without a new master, had failed because of a moment he had not anticipated, and the wand's ultimate fate, returning to Harry who buried it with Dumbledore's restored body, achieving in the end something close to what Dumbledore had intended, came through a chain of events Dumbledore had not designed and could not have predicted. The plan worked, but it worked messily, on the edge, through the particular stubbornness of magic that follows its own logic regardless of the plans made by even the most careful wizards. This is worth holding in mind when considering the full scope of Dumbledore's planning. He was extraordinary. He was also building on uncertainty, and he knew it. Draco Malfoy spent his 6th year at Hogwarts trying to do something he could not make himself do. He had been assigned by Voldemort, at the beginning of that year, to kill Albus Dumbledore. The assignment was partly punitive. His father Lucius had failed at the Department of Mysteries in Harry's 5th year, and the Malfoy family stood in need of rehabilitation in Voldemort's estimation. Draco's success in this mission would restore the family's standing. His failure would be another piece of evidence against them. Draco spent the year working on 2 approaches. He attempted to have Dumbledore killed by proxy, using a cursed necklace that passed through Katie Bell on its way to the headmaster and nearly killed Bell instead. He attempted to use a poisoned bottle of mead that ended up being consumed by Ron Weasley, who also nearly died. Neither attempt reached its intended target. By the end of the year, Draco had gotten nowhere, except deeper into a crisis about what he actually was and what he was actually capable of. On the astronomy tower, when he finally had Dumbledore at one point, he hesitated. Dumbledore saw the hesitation and understood it immediately. Draco was 16 years old and frightened, and had been handed an impossible task by a man who expected him to fail. Killing was not something Draco Malfoy was, in his actual nature. The performance of cruelty had been part of his social armor for years, learned from his father, deployed at school against people he had been raised to consider less than him. But actual killing, the deliberate ending of a life, required a part of Draco that had not been built. Dumbledore talked to him on the tower. He talked to him calmly, in the tones of a man with time to spare, which was not technically untrue since both of them were waiting for the same thing. He told Draco that it was not too late to choose differently. He told Draco that he and his mother could be hidden, protected from Voldemort's reach, if Draco would only come to the right side. He meant it. The offer was genuine, but it was also part of the construction. The way nearly everything Dumbledore said in this period was both genuine and part of the construction. He was buying time for Snape to arrive. He was keeping Draco from making the killing blow, and he was, in a way that Draco could not know, protecting Draco's soul. The magical mechanics of this matter. In wizarding understanding, the act of killing another person damages the soul in ways that cannot be repaired. A person who commits murder does something to themselves at a level below consciousness, something that alters the fundamental texture of who they are. Voldemort had done this so many times that his soul had been reduced to barely a remnant. Dumbledore did not want Draco Malfoy, 16 years old and still, at some level, a frightened boy carrying his family's failures, to do that to himself. So he arranged things so that Draco would not have to. Snape killed Dumbledore. Draco was present and appeared, from the outside, to have been part of a Death Eater operation that succeeded. His cover with Voldemort was maintained, his soul remained intact, and the mercy Dumbledore extended, the careful management of the tower's events to ensure Draco neither had to kill, nor had to visibly refuse to kill, was one of the most deliberate pieces of the whole arrangement. He could not tell anyone about this mercy afterward. He was dead. Draco Malfoy, for the year that followed, carried the weight of being the boy who had participated in Dumbledore's death, without any context for the care that had been taken on his behalf. The mercy was real, and it was generous, and it was invisible, which is the kind of mercy Dumbledore dealt in throughout his life. By the summer of 1996, Albus Dumbledore had done the necessary calculus. The curse from the Resurrection Stone ring had been contained by Snape, but not reversed. It was moving through his system slowly, and even with Snape's management, it would claim him within roughly a year. He had a fixed period of time remaining, and he had an enormous amount of remaining work to do within it. He also had the certainty, which he had been approaching for some time, that his death could be made to serve purposes beyond his own ending. He sat down, at some point in that summer, and worked out the plan's architecture. Draco Malfoy would be tasked with killing him. Draco would fail to complete the task, as Dumbledore believed he would, not from certainty about Draco's character, but from probability. Snape, positioned as defense against the dark arts professor that year, would be on hand when the moment came, having been told to be there, and having agreed to do what was required. Dumbledore would die at Snape's hand, on the astronomy tower, in the manner that would serve the plan for the Elder Wand's succession. After his death, Snape would remain at Hogwarts. Voldemort, after the Ministry fell, would install Snape as headmaster, which would give Snape a position to mitigate the worst of what happened to the students, while maintaining the appearance of full cooperation. He would protect who he could, punish as minimally as the situation allowed, and wait for Harry. Harry would spend the year hunting Horcruxes with Ron and Hermione, following what Dumbledore had laid out in the lessons of the previous year, working through the list of remaining objects. Eventually Harry would come to the Shrieking Shack. Snape would be there, dying or near death, because Voldemort would have tried to transfer the Elder Wand's mastery to himself by killing Snape. Snape would give Harry his memories. Harry would go to the Pensieve and see the truth about what he was and what he had to do. Dumbledore had staged those memories inside Snape's mind years before the Battle of Hogwarts. He had crafted the information with care, selecting what Harry needed to know and in what order, building toward the conclusion that Harry had to go willingly to his death. He had done this knowing he would not be present to deliver it himself, and knowing that the delivery mechanism, Snape giving memories to Harry with his dying breath, would carry the maximum possible emotional weight. He had also thought about what Harry would see when he went to the pensieve. The memories he staged included the conversation in which Dumbledore tells Snape that Harry must die, and Snape's response, the one word that became, after everything, the most devastating single syllable in the story, always. The memory of Snape's Do Patronus, silver in a winter forest, leading Harry to the sword hidden in the frozen pond. The moment of understanding between Dumbledore and Snape about what Dumbledore truly was, a man who had been raising Harry like an animal kept for slaughter. That phrase was Snape's. He said it directly to Dumbledore in the argument about Harry's fate, and Dumbledore let the accusation land without refuting it, because there was not a refutation available that he would have been entirely comfortable with. He was raising Harry for a specific death, a necessary death, followed by a specific kind of survival, but a death planned from roughly the moment Dumbledore understood what Harry was. He managed Harry's development, his courage, his capacity for self-sacrifice, the relationships that would make him worth fighting for, the understanding of love that would allow him to choose death for others' sakes, with a goal that Harry did not know was there. This is not comfortable. Dumbledore was uncomfortable with it himself. He told Snape, after the accusation, that he hoped Harry would be given the chance to know, at the end, why his sacrifice was necessary. He hoped Harry would choose it freely, not under compulsion, but out of genuine understanding and genuine willingness. He spent the year of lessons trying to build the kind of person who could make that choice freely, but he also arranged the situation so that there was no alternative. If Harry had not gone to the forest, if he had refused at the last moment, or not understood what the memories meant, the whole plan would have required revision. Dumbledore was relying on the person he had helped Harry become, and the reliance was genuine, but the situation he had built left Harry very little room. He took all of this with him, not to Snape, who knew the parts he needed to know, not to anyone else at all. The Order of the Phoenix, during both its periods of active operation, was not a democracy. Dumbledore founded it, led it, and decided what information flowed through it. This was understood, at least implicitly, by the people who joined. They trusted him, and they let him run things, partly because his track record justified trust, and partly because the nature of fighting a dark wizard who had followers inside the ministry made compartmentalization a genuine necessity. You could not share everything with everyone when some percentage of those people might be compromised. But Dumbledore extended this principle well beyond what security required. He did not tell the Order that Snape was a genuine double agent. He told them Snape was trustworthy without specifying the basis for that trust, which meant that when Snape killed him on the astronomy tower, the entire Order of the Phoenix, with the possible exception of any person Dumbledore might have taken into confidence, believed they had been betrayed. This was a predictable consequence of his choice not to share the information, and he made it anyway. His reasoning, presumably, was that if Snape's true allegiance had been known among the Order, the risk of it somehow reaching Death Eater ears was too high. That reasoning may be sound, but the cost to the people inside the Order, who spent a year grieving and raging at Snape, was real and not trivial. He did not tell the Order that Harry was a Horcrux. He did not tell the Order that there were 6 Horcruxes to find, then 7 including Harry. He did not tell Moody, or Tonks, or Lupin, or any of the others what the actual shape of the war was, what the actual conditions of victory were, what the actual price would be. He told them to protect Harry and trust him, and left the architecture of everything they were fighting for in his own head. He did not tell Hermione Granger, who might have been the most intellectually equipped person to receive the information about Harry, any of the significant truths. He left her to figure things out from clues, some of which he deliberately arranged. The tale of the 3 brothers in the copy of the Tales of Beedle the Bard that he left her in his will was not an accident. He wanted her to find the connection between the story and the real Hallows without being told directly. He was, in this as in many things, engineering the discovery rather than making it. He did not tell Ron Weasley that his Deluminator had been modified. that it would respond to Ron's own internal compass in ways that went beyond its original function. He simply left it to Ron in his will, trusting that when the time came, the modified instrument would find Ron and bring him back to where he needed to be. He left them a book, he left them a device, he left Harry a snitch with a stone inside it, and a sword they had to find themselves, and memories delivered by a dying man. He prepared for them, without including them. He gave them tools, without explaining the tools. And then he died, and they had to put it together. When Harry confronted what felt like the complete picture in King's Cross, in whatever version of reality that conversation between the dead and the not quite dead occupies, he told Dumbledore that he had been kept in the dark about too much for too long. The criticism was not phrased as a comfortable or gentle one. He said it with the exhaustion of someone who had carried weight they had not been warned about. Dumbledore, in that conversation, agreed with him. He said that he was not a perfect man. He said that his reasons had seemed good to him, but that good reasons did not always justify their costs. He said it with what sounded like genuine regret, and what sounded also like the confession of a man who, if he could do it again, would probably make most of the same choices because he believed, in the end, that they had worked. The conversation that Harry and Dumbledore have in King's Cross is the closest the story comes to Dumbledore accounting for his secrets. It is not a complete accounting. There are things he does not explain there either. But the fact that he agreed with the criticism, that he said explicitly that he had made mistakes in how he had distributed trust, suggests he understood, by the end, that keeping secrets had costs beyond the strategic ones he had been calculating. What he never quite resolved, even there, was the question of whether a different approach might have worked equally well with fewer costs, whether Harry, told the truth earlier, would have been capable of the same courage, whether Snape, given more acknowledgement of what he was being asked to carry, would have survived better, whether the people around Dumbledore, given more information and more genuine partnership, would have found worse outcomes or better ones. He died without resolving these questions, which means they remain open, as he left so many things. In the years between Grindelwald's first defeat and Voldemort's rise, there was a period in which the magical world tried to convince itself that the worst was behind it. 1945 had brought what seemed like resolution. The Dark Wizard was in prison. The Elder Wand had a new master who showed no interest in domination. The Statute of Secrecy held. This sense of calm was not wrong exactly, but it was incomplete. The ideas that had given Grindelwald his following did not end when Grindelwald went to Nurmengard. And Grindelwald himself, sitting in the prison he had built for others, had not stopped thinking. The events in America in the 1920s, a decade before Grindelwald's full European campaign, introduced a figure whose story connected to Dumbledore's in ways that did not resolve themselves fully within Dumbledore's lifetime. Credence Barebone, a young man raised in a fanatical anti-magic household by an adoptive mother who both feared and abused magic in others, had developed an obscurus of extraordinary power, the kind of obscurus that should not have been able to survive in a human host past early childhood, the kind that, if it could be directed or controlled, represented a weapon unlike anything in conventional magical arsenals. Grindelwald, in America pursuing his own agenda under a false identity, found Credence and saw exactly this. He spent months cultivating Credence's trust, presenting himself as someone who could give Credence an identity, an origin, a name that would place him inside the magical world, rather than at its violent margins. He then revealed himself to Credence at the worst possible moment and abandoned him, because Credence's usefulness to Grindelwald's actual plans had ended. Credence survived. Credence followed Grindelwald to Europe, and Grindelwald, who never wasted a tool he might still use, told Credence the most devastating possible lie. He told Credence that he was Aurelius Dumbledore, a secret brother, the hidden child, the one that Albus had concealed from the wizarding world. He gave Credence a wand he called the Wand of Destiny, told him his true purpose was to destroy Albus Dumbledore, and watched Credence take on an identity built entirely from the negative space around Dumbledore's history. The lie was brilliant, in the way that the cruelest deceptions always are. It used real things. Dumbledore did have a history of concealment and family secrets. The Dumbledore family did have chapters that had been kept from public knowledge. And Credence, who had spent his entire life with no real name, no identity of his own, was desperately available for the first story that made him into something other than a victim. Whether Credence was actually an Aurelius Dumbledore is a question that the available historical record does not settle cleanly. The genealogies of wizarding families in the late 19th century are not thoroughly documented, and the circumstances of the Dumbledore family's private life before Ariana's trauma included enough complexity that a gap in the record is not impossible. But the most likely interpretation, held by most people who have studied the period, is that Grindelwald created the story of Aurelius Dumbledore from scratch, because creating that story gave him a weapon pointed directly at the man he could not attack himself. For Dumbledore, learning that Grindelwald had constructed a false brother out of a damaged young man, using the gaps in his own family's hidden history as the raw material, was a particular kind of wound. It used the summer, it used Ariana, it used everything Dumbledore had worked for decades to manage and contain. Grindelwald, from inside his prison, was reaching across the years and the miles and finding the exact shape of the injury he had caused in 1999, the injury Dumbledore had spent his life building around and pressing on it. Dumbledore could not confront Grindelwald about this. The blood pact, still intact, prevented direct action. He could not reach Credence easily. He had to work through others, through Newt Scamander and Theseus and the people around them, finding ways to address the threat of Credence without being able to explain fully why the threat was so personally significant to him. He told the people around him, in this period, very little about what he felt. The blood pact was still private. The specifics of what Grindelwald had constructed and why it hurt were not things he shared. He maintained the manner he had always maintained, calm, deliberate, appearing to weigh options rather than to be managing the open wound of another person being turned into a weapon by the same person who had caused the first one. The crisis was eventually resolved, but it was resolved in ways that Dumbledore had not fully controlled, and the damage done along the way, to Credence and to others, was not something that Dumbledore's careful management had been able to prevent. The Credence situation is one of the clearest places where Dumbledore's habit of keeping secrets compounded an existing harm rather than managing it. If the blood pact had been known, if the full context of what Grindelwald was doing and why had been shared with the people involved, the situation might have been handled with more information in more hands, which might have produced better outcomes for Credence. But sharing the context meant sharing the summer, and sharing the summer was something Dumbledore was not ready to do. The lesson here, if it is a lesson, rather than simply a fact about how he operated, is that secrets have a gravitational pull. One secret requires other secrets to protect it, and each of those requires more. By the time Dumbledore was managing the events of the Credence situation, he was maintaining an entire architecture of concealment, whose original foundation had been built in a summer more than 30 years earlier. The structure was stable, in the way that structures built on shame can be stable for a long time. But when pressure was applied, the instability at the base made everything above it harder to manage. There is a scene in the last year of the war that happens in the Forbidden Forest at Hogwarts, and that almost nobody witnessed, and that may be the most important thing that Albus Dumbledore planned for in all the years of planning. Harry Potter walked into the forest at dawn during the Battle of Hogwarts, alone. He had seen the memory. He understood what he was and what it required. He had opened the snitch, turned the stone, and walked toward Voldemort, with his dead parents and godfather and friend moving at his side for comfort. And he arrived at the clearing where Voldemort was waiting, and he did not raise his wand, and Voldemort cast the killing curse. Harry fell. The forest went quiet. And then the things that Dumbledore had understood and planned for happened exactly as he had trusted they would. The Horcrux inside Harry died. The fragment of Voldemort's soul, the uninvited passenger that had been with Harry since infancy, was destroyed. But Harry was not destroyed with it, because Voldemort's blood in his veins had preserved the protection, and the curse could not kill the host after the parasite was gone. Harry lay in the forest, and the liminal space that is somewhere between living and dead, and had a conversation with a projection of Dumbledore's understanding in what appeared to be King's Cross Station, and then he woke up. But the preparation for this moment was decades in the making. Not only the Horcrux piece, though that was central, Dumbledore had been building toward this specific moment for years, by shaping Harry's character in particular ways. The shape he was building toward was a person capable of genuine, willing self-sacrifice, not theatrical heroism, not the impulse to die dramatically while doing something brave, the specific, quiet courage required to walk without running, to choose death without resistance, to allow the worst to happen because allowing it is the right thing. That quality is not common. Many people who would fight bravely against a dark wizard would nonetheless flinch from walking toward their own death without a wand raised. Dumbledore believed Harry had the capacity for it, because of what he had observed since Harry first arrived at Hogwarts. The way Harry had responded to threat, consistently, was to think about the people around him first. When he found the Philosopher's Stone in the mirror, his thought was to prevent Voldemort from using it, not to use it himself. When he went into the Chamber of Secrets in his second year, it was for Ginny Weasley, not for glory. When he entered the Triwizard Tournament, even under the compulsion of the goblet, his behavior within the tasks was defined by the people around him, as much as by competition. The fourth task ended with him insisting on bringing Cedric Diggory's body home. These were not accidents. Some of them were. But Harry's persistent pattern of choosing others over himself, which Dumbledore had been observing and carefully noting for years, was the thing on which the entire plan rested. What Dumbledore arranged, in addition to the information about the Horcrux and the stone in the snitch, was the particular quality of the revelation. He staged the memories for Snape to deliver in a way that would give Harry the truth at the moment when the truth would be most like a gift rather than a burden. By the time Harry saw the memories, he had already been through 7 years of loss and struggle. He had already developed the character that could receive the information and respond to it correctly. Dumbledore had, in the gentlest and most controlled way possible, been building toward the revelation all along. The King's Cross conversation is worth pausing on. In whatever space that represents, Harry finds a version of Dumbledore that knows everything, that exists outside the normal constraints of what can and cannot be said. And Dumbledore, in that conversation, is more honest with Harry than he was in 17 years of living. He admits the plan in full. He admits his mistakes. He tells Harry, directly, that he loved him. He asks Harry's forgiveness for what his plan required Harry to endure. He tells Harry that he has the choice to go back or to move on. This is Dumbledore at his most unguarded. The armor of institutional authority is gone. The careful management of what information Harry should have is gone. What is left is an old man talking to the boy he loved and had used and hoped could forgive him. Harry went back. He chose life. He ended the war. And the conversation in King's Cross is the closest thing in the entire record to Dumbledore's secrets being acknowledged. He could not have had it while he was alive, because having it required him to be dead. The accounting of what he had held, and why, and at what cost, was only possible when there was no longer any strategic reason to hold it. Albus Dumbledore's pensieve, the shallow stone basin in his office into which he deposited excess thoughts and memories for later review, was not a storage device. It was, over the course of his adult life, more like a private library. Into it, he placed the things he needed to process, but not carry constantly. The things he needed to have available without keeping them in the front of his mind. The things he was not yet sure what to do with. When Harry Potter was first brought to that office and shown a memory using the pensieve, he understood it primarily as a tool for sharing information. And it was that. But it was also the place where Dumbledore kept the things he needed to think about, which is to say, among others, the things he had not yet resolved. There are memories Dumbledore deposited into the pensieve that Harry never saw. The evidence of this is the nature of what Harry did see. The memories shown to Harry were curated. They were selected for their educational value to Harry's specific situation. They were the memories that a careful teacher might choose for a student being prepared for something specific. They were not random or complete. What they left out tells its own story. Harry never saw a memory of the summer of 1899. He knew about it from Aberforth, from Rita Skeeter's sensationalist biography, from fragments of information assembled from multiple sources. But Dumbledore did not show him the summer, did not show him Grindelwald, did not show him Ariana's death, did not show him the moment when the philosophy of the greater good first took hold in a 17-year-old mind and produced plans that echoed, in their shape and their consequences, the later ambitions of the dark wizard who had shared them. Harry never saw a memory of Dumbledore putting on the ring, the moment of weakness where years of control collapsed in front of an object that promised what he most wanted. He heard about it from Dumbledore's explanation, but explanation and showing are different things. To have shown the memory would have been to let Harry see, in full detail, the unguarded moment. The old man's hand reaching for the ring despite everything he knew. The specific expression on his face in the seconds before the curse struck. Harry never saw a memory of what Dumbledore and Snape discussed in the years between Snape's return to the school and Dumbledore's death. Those conversations, in which the full architecture of the plan was assembled, in which Snape's reactions and protests and eventual agreement were worked through, remain in the pensieve or in Dumbledore's memory alone. The Snape memories Harry saw were Snape's own, given by Snape in his dying moments, shaped around what Dumbledore wanted Harry to know, not around the complete record. There are things in the pensieve that nobody retrieved after Dumbledore's death. Minerva McGonagall became headmistress and inherited the office, and therefore the pensieve. What she did with its contents, whether she examined the memories, whether she preserved them, whether some of them were eventually shared with the historical record, is not information that has been made fully available. The interior of Albus Dumbledore's private thought archive, the things he found important enough to keep but not important enough to show, remains largely unexamined. This is appropriate, in a way. The man who kept secrets also kept them in the place where they would be hardest to reach, deposited in stone, filed away behind memories he did choose to share. The private record of his inner life remains imperfectly accessible, even to history. What can be said with confidence is that Albus Dumbledore used the pensieve, throughout his life, as a companion to the self-examination he practiced, but practiced privately. He reviewed his own past in that basin. He looked at the things he had done and the things he had not done. He sat in the office of headmaster and watched himself being 17, probably, and being 50, and being 112, and he processed what he found there alone. Whether he found peace in that process, whether the repeated examination of his own history brought him to anything resembling resolution, is something the record does not tell us. He was calm in his final years. He was generous and warm, and full of the particular quality of presence that people noticed about him. He could have been at peace, or he could have been someone who had simply learned, over a very long time, to hold his not peace very still. He did not say. All of these secrets, taken together, point toward a single question, not the question of whether Dumbledore was good, which admits of an easy answer, even if the easy answer is complicated at its edges. The harder question is, was keeping secrets the best available strategy, or was it a habit that Dumbledore had built in shame and then justified with strategy, because the justification came more naturally than the honesty? The case for the strategy is not thin. A double agent is only useful while their cover is maintained. Harry's behavior, as Snape suggested, would have been materially different if he had known he was going to have to let himself be killed. The blood pact, while it existed, gave Dumbledore a genuine reason not to announce his inability to act directly against Grindelwald, since announcing it would have been strategically useless. These are not nothing, but there is something else present throughout the record that goes beyond strategy. There is a consistent pattern of Dumbledore not sharing things that would have been safe to share, not just dangerous to share. He did not tell Harry what he saw in the mirror of Erised, which would not have compromised any strategic objective. He did not tell Aberforth what the plan for Snape's role was, even in the final months when Aberforth had come back into some degree of contact with the wizarding resistance. He did not tell the people closest to him, at any point in his life, anything resembling the complete picture of who he was and what he carried. The strategic argument for secrecy holds in the specific cases. The full application of secrecy across his entire life is harder to attribute entirely to strategy. The more honest accounting is probably that Albus Dumbledore had been shaped, in the summer of 1899, into a person who kept his most important truths private, and that this shaping was so fundamental and so early that it influenced everything afterward in ways he could not always see clearly from the inside. He was not, at his core, someone who distrusted others. The relationships he built over his long life, with Snape and McGonagall and Hagrid and Harry and the members of the Order, were genuine. He cared about them. He felt their losses. He mourned Cedric Diggory, and he mourned Sirius Black, and he mourned the Muggleborns, and the families destroyed in both wars. His warmth was not a performance. His interest in the people around him was real. But between caring about someone and trusting them fully with your own interior life, Dumbledore had built a wall. It was not a wall of contempt. It was a wall built from the conviction that the complete picture of who he was, a person who had once planned the domination of the Muggle world, and whose love for the man who later executed that plan had prevented him from stopping it sooner, was not something that could be shared without damaging the image that other people needed of him. He was the symbol, the lighthouse, the steady point. If he had shown people who he fully was, they might have been unable to maintain that image of him. He may have been right. He may have been protecting their ability to trust him, which was itself something they needed. He may also have been protecting himself, which is not shameful but is different, and which he rarely said directly. The summer of 1899 cost Albus Dumbledore's sister. It cost him his friendship with his brother for decades, until the final years repaired something between them. It cost him the man he had loved. It cost him the certainty about his own judgment that a young person needs, and that he spent the rest of his life substituting with something more careful and more suspicious. He built something remarkable from the wreckage of that summer. He became the teacher and the leader and the symbol that the wizarding world needed. He made choices that worked, in the end, in the way that matters most. The war was won. Harry survived. The people who had to be protected, most of them, were protected. And the cost of it, the real cost, was paid not only by Albus Dumbledore, but by every person in his life who was given a piece of him instead of the whole thing. Snape, who knew more than almost anyone, and still did not know everything. Harry, who loved a headmaster before he understood the man. Aberforth, who spent his life at the end of Albus's long shadow and found out only slowly, in fragments, that there was grief underneath it he might have shared. The secrets did not make Dumbledore bad. They make him human in the way that the most interesting people are human, specific and limited in ways that their abilities do not eliminate. He was brilliant and he was flawed, and the flaw was not in the brilliance or in the goodness of his intentions, but in the gap between how much he felt and how little he let those feelings be anyone else's business. He could have told Harry more, sooner. He chose not to. He could have told the Order more, earlier. He chose not to. He could have, at some point in the decades between 1945 and 1997, spoken publicly about the summer with Grindelwald, about the love and the plans and the pact and the years of paralysis and what had really driven them. He chose not to. He went to his grave carrying the summer, carrying Ariana, carrying the question of whose spell it was, carrying the knowledge of the blood pact and the mirror's answer, and the cursed ring, and the Horcrux he had shaped a boy's life around destroying, carrying the Elder Wand's full history, carrying what Snape had agreed to do, and the weight of having asked it, carrying what Draco had not had to become, carrying the plan for the forest. He carried all of it into the white space of whatever comes after, and he left the people he had loved with the fragments they had been given, and the task of putting it together. They did. Harry put it together in King's Cross, and in the hours after, and then he lived with what he had learned, and raised a family, and named his children for the people whose secrets had shaped him. Ronald and Hermione and Ginny put it together from what they knew, and what they worked out, and what history eventually provided. Aberforth put it together from the end of a bar in Hogsmeade, and kept most of his conclusions to himself, as his brother would have recognized. Snape's role was eventually understood by the wizarding world, and eventually his portrait hung in the headmaster's office with the others, which is the institutional equivalent of acknowledgement. And Albus Dumbledore's portrait, hanging there too, smiled at visitors, and offered lemon drops and deflected questions with characteristic warmth. Even in paint and enchantment, he kept something back. That is who he was, not despite everything, but including everything. The summer, the sister, the love, the pact, the plan, the secrets, the cost. It is what made him Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, the greatest headmaster Hogwarts ever knew, the one wizard Voldemort genuinely feared, the man who prepared a boy to save the world without ever quite letting the boy see the full weight of the burden he was carrying on the boy's behalf. Whether that was wisdom, or pride, or love, or some unresolved mixture of all three, is the final question the record leaves open, and it is open in the way that the best questions always are, not because the answer does not exist, but because the answer keeps changing, depending on where you stand when you ask it. If tonight's exploration of Albus Dumbledore has brought you to the edge of sleep, stay there, let your eyes close, let the warmth of that closing settle in. Before you drift fully away, if you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing. Leave a like on the video so that others searching for something calm and long and detailed can find this channel. And if you want to return for more nights like this one, turn on notifications so that nothing is missed. We will be here the next time you need a long story to carry you somewhere quiet. Rest now. There is still a little more to hear, and you can hear it in the dark with your eyes closed. After the Battle of Hogwarts, the wizarding world rebuilt around the shape that Dumbledore had planned for. The Ministry was restored under leadership that was not controlled by Voldemort's allies. Hogwarts reopened. The Dementors that had been roaming the country were returned to Azkaban, though there were serious ongoing conversations about whether Azkaban itself was an institution that should continue in its existing form. The families who had survived began the particular work of living that follows catastrophe. Albus Dumbledore's reputation, in the immediate aftermath of the war, was somewhat more complicated than it had been during his lifetime. Rita Skeeter's biography had raised questions about the summer with Grindelwald that the wizarding public had not previously had access to. The revelation that Dumbledore had once shared Grindelwald's philosophy, had once been in a close personal relationship with the man who became the most dangerous dark wizard of the 20th century before Voldemort, was not something that everyone received with the same equanimity. There were people who felt that this history, once known, cast everything Dumbledore had done in a different light. People who asked, with some justification, how much the 46-year delay in confronting Grindelwald had actually been about the Blood Pact, and how much had been about something harder to name. People who pointed out that the greatest wizard of his age had access to enormous resources during those decades, and had not always deployed them in ways that minimized suffering. There were also people who argued that none of this changed what he had accomplished, that the history of every great figure is more complicated than the legend that grows up around them, and that the measure of a person is what they do in the long run, rather than who they were at 17. That argument is not wrong. It is also convenient, in the way that defenses of legacy tend to be convenient. What the historical debate misses, because historical debates usually miss the interior, is the question of what those 46 years cost Dumbledore himself, not just in terms of what he was unable to prevent during Grindelwald's campaign, but in terms of the man he spent those decades becoming. Every year of watching and waiting and managing the situation from a distance, while maintaining the fiction that it was a choice rather than a binding, was a year of carrying that particular secret. And carrying a secret of that magnitude for that long shapes the person carrying it. He became, over those decades, someone who managed information as a reflex, someone who calibrated what to share and with whom, with the automatic precision of a practiced habit. Someone who had made keeping his own interior unavailable to examination into such a complete professional skill that it was indistinguishable from his personality. He also became, over those same decades, someone who thought about the costs of that management with increasing clarity. The lessons he offered Harry in his 6th year were not simply strategic. They were, in part, Dumbledore's attempt to give Harry something he himself had not been given: full information, trust, the experience of being treated as a genuine partner in the work, rather than a managed resource. He did not fully succeed at this, but the attempt was real, and it represented a departure from everything he had done before. He told Harry more than he had told anyone. Still not everything, but more. In Harry's 6th year, sitting in the headmaster's office sharing memories of Voldemort's history, Dumbledore was closer to transparent than he had been in any previous relationship in his adult life. The relationship between them, as a consequence, was closer to what genuine partnership looks like than most of what Dumbledore had built before. What might he have built if he had started earlier, if the summer of 1899 had ended differently, or been processed differently, or if the habit of concealment had been interrupted somewhere in the decades that followed? These are not questions with answerable answers, which is probably why Dumbledore spent so much time asking them in private. They are the questions available only to hindsight, and to the pensieve, and to whatever quiet accounting goes on in the spaces between a long life's chapters. He made himself into a legend. He did not intend the legend to be complete. The things he kept out of the legend were the same things that would have made it harder to be the legend. That was not vanity exactly. It was a calculation about function. A symbol needs certain properties, and one of those properties is a degree of mystery, a sense that the symbol exists at a level slightly above ordinary human limitation. He maintained that mystery, partly out of shame and partly out of calculation, and partly out of the simple momentum of having maintained it for so long that not maintaining it would have required a kind of active dismantling he never quite arrived at. He is, in the end, more interesting for the secrets than he would have been without them. A man without secrets and without flaws is an idea, not a person. The version of Albus Dumbledore that history was given, the wise old headmaster dispensing lemon drops and counsel with equal ease, is a vivid figure. The version that includes the summer and the pact and the resurrection stone ring and the 46 years and the plan for Harry is a full one. His grave at Hogwarts, in the marble tomb on the grounds near the lake, holds the Elder Wand, as Harry placed it there. The wand that was at the centre of so much that Grindelwald sought and won and lost to Dumbledore, and that eventually passed through Draco Malfoy and into Harry's hands and was used to kill Voldemort before returning to the tomb, rests with the man who won it. That seems right, whatever right means in the context of objects with this much weight attached to them. The tomb does not hold everything. The grave of Ariana Dumbledore, in the churchyard at Godric's Hollow, holds something too. The question of who cast the fatal spell. The girl who might have been an obscurial, the sister whose condition was hidden for decades and whose death was the engine of everything that came afterward. These two graves are the brackets of the secrets. Ariana's holds the origin of the habit. Albus's holds the continuation of it. Between them, across most of a century, one man carried the weight of both. On the evening that the story ends, Harry Potter is standing in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, watching the survivors tend to their dead. He is 19 years old. His lightning bolt scar has stopped hurting, and he understands that it will not hurt again. He is holding the Elder Wand, which he has just used to repair his own Holly and Phoenix Feather Wand, and he intends to put it back in the tomb. He is thinking about Dumbledore. Specifically, he is thinking about the conversation in King's Cross. The version of Dumbledore there had been the most direct he had ever encountered. He had said things he had never said in life. He had acknowledged the plan and the cost and the hope that it had not been too much to ask. He had asked, in the gentlest possible way, whether Harry forgave him. Harry did not answer that question in King's Cross. He went back to life, and there was a war to finish, and then there was the aftermath of the war. Whether he answered it in his own mind, in the years that followed, the historical record does not say. His two children named for Dumbledore's closest associates suggests something. The way he spoke about Dumbledore in later life, with the particular kind of love that includes clear-eyed understanding of the person's limits, suggests something else. What Harry understood, by the end, was the full shape of what Dumbledore had been doing. He understood that the lessons in the 6th year were preparation for what he would need to know. He understood that the objects left in the will were tools selected with care. He understood that the plan for Snape had been assembled over years, and that Snape had been asked to carry something enormous, and had carried it. He understood that the forest, and what happened in the forest, had been anticipated by the man who sent him there. He also understood, in the way that you understand things after you have lived them, rather than been told them, that Dumbledore had loved him, not in the simple, unambiguous way of parents, not in the way of a man with nothing to weigh against the love, but genuinely, and in the way available to Dumbledore, which was the way of a person who loved, while managing the implications of that love, for the purposes the love was meant to serve. That is an unusual kind of love to be on the receiving end of. It is also, Harry probably came to understand, the only kind available from Albus Dumbledore, the version of him that loved simply without strategy, without the overlay of purpose, was the version that had been 17 in Godric's Hollow and had not survived the summer intact. What remained was a man who loved through plans, who loved by preparing things carefully for later, who loved in the way that a person loves when they have learned to be suspicious of what their love might cause. The secrets Dumbledore took to his grave are not, in the end, separable from the love that was also there. The secrecy and the love were products of the same experience, the same summer, the same formation. He had learned to love while keeping something back, and he never fully unlearned it. What he gave Harry, in the end, was not a complete accounting of himself. It was something closer to what was necessary, the right amount of truth at the right moment, managed and calibrated and prepared with enormous care, delivered from beyond death, through a dying man's memories, and through a basin of silver thought, in a stone headmaster's office, arriving in the forest exactly when it needed to arrive. a 17-year-old boy in Godric's Hollow, had believed, for one burning summer, that extraordinary people had the right to manage the world on behalf of the ordinary people in it. He had been wrong about that, and had spent the rest of his life knowing he had been wrong, and had tried to atone for it by being very careful about what extraordinary meant and what it was worth. What he arrived at, after nearly a century of trying, was not management from above. It was preparation rather than direction, not telling people what to do and doing it for them, but giving them what they needed to choose for themselves, even if what they needed was sometimes given secretly, in objects and wills and staged memories. Even if the choosing itself was shaped by a plan, even if Harry's choice in the forest had been prepared for years and depended on character that Dumbledore had been observing and trusting all along. He let Harry choose. He let Snape choose. He let Draco Malfoy, on the astronomy tower, face the moment of choice without taking it away from him. He let the people he trusted make the decisions that needed to be made, and he trusted them to make those decisions out of who they were, rather than out of what he had told them. That, in the end, was what the greatest wizard of the age believed, that the people capable of doing what needed to be done were already there, already themselves, already carrying what they needed. They did not need to be controlled. They needed to be trusted, even if the trust had to be managed in ways they could not see from where they stood. He was probably right about this. He was also probably right that he had trusted himself too much in the summer of 1899, and too little in the years that followed. The distance between those two eras is where Albus Dumbledore lived his entire life, finding the right amount of trust, and the right amount of caution, and the right distance between what he knew and what he shared, and getting it partly wrong in each direction, and trying again. He is buried at Hogwarts. The lake is near. The grounds are green, or white, or brilliant with the turning of seasons that move regardless of what happens on the grounds. And in the headmaster's office, his portrait keeps the hours. It smiles at visitors. It offers advice when asked and deflects when not. It watches the school that shaped him and that he shaped in return, and it says nothing about what it carries, because even in paint and enchantment, Albus Dumbledore keeps certain things for himself. The scar on Harry Potter's forehead does not hurt anymore. He is at peace. And somewhere, in the space where the story goes when you close your eyes and let it carry you, Ariana Dumbledore is alive, in a garden in a village that still exists, on a summer afternoon that has no end. Her brother sees her there, sometimes. He does not say. The deeper summer, what Grindelwald gave him and what it cost. There is something about the summer of 1899 that requires more time than a single chapter can hold. The thing that happened to Albus Dumbledore that summer was not simply the event of Ariana's death, or the discovery that the man he loved was the man who would become Europe's most dangerous dark wizard, or even the blood pact sealed in the garden by two young men who believed they were choosing partnership rather than binding themselves to eventual grief. All of those things happened and all of them mattered, but what the summer actually did, at a level beneath the events, was something more architectural. Albus arrived at Godric's Hollow in the spring of 1899, knowing he was brilliant. He had spent 7 years at Hogwarts, having this confirmed by everyone around him, professors and students alike, and the knowledge had settled into him as a fact about the world rather than a piece of his own self-image. He was brilliant. Water was wet. The sun rose in the east. He had never had reason to examine whether the brilliance was something he had earned or something he simply was, and the question had never occurred to him, because nobody around him had given him cause to ask it. Grindelwald asked it. Not directly, not in a way that seemed like a challenge. He asked it by treating Albus's brilliance as unremarkable, because Grindelwald was brilliant too, and by treating the question of what brilliance was worth as the genuinely interesting one. What do people of extraordinary ability owe the world? Not in the abstract, not as a philosophical exercise, but in concrete and practical terms. The answer Grindelwald was moving toward was that they owed the world their willingness to use that ability without the usual restraints, without the modesty that was expected of powerful people, without the deference to systems and laws that had been built by and for ordinary minds. Albus heard this argument and responded to it, and the response was not only about Grindelwald or about love. He had spent 7 years performing humility in an environment that asked for it. He was tired of the performance. He wanted to say, yes, I am exceptional, and the exceptionalism matters, and I should be allowed to act from it without apologizing. Grindelwald gave him the philosophical language for that desire, wrapped it in a set of ideas about the relationship between magical ability and responsibility to the broader world, and made it feel like moral seriousness rather than pride. This is the thing that Albus could never quite say in later life, when he was asked about the summer. He could say that Grindelwald had seduced him intellectually. He could say that their shared philosophy had been wrong, and that the events of that summer had shown him how wrong it was. He could not quite say, because it required naming something he had worked for decades to keep private, that he had wanted to believe it, that the greater good philosophy had resonated with him, not because Grindelwald had tricked him, but because some part of him had wanted to believe that being exceptional carried the right to act exceptionally, outside the ordinary rules. He had felt the pull of that belief again when he put on the cursed ring. He had felt something similar when he arranged the stone at Hogwarts, when he constructed the elaborate architecture of the plan for Harry, when he decided unilaterally what Harry could know and when. The instinct to manage things from above, to decide what others needed without consulting them, is not a foreign instinct to someone who genuinely believes they understand the situation more clearly than the people inside it. Dumbledore understood the situation more clearly. He usually did. The question that haunted him, after the summer, was whether that clarity gave him the right to act on it the way he did. He decided it did not, at 17, lying on the floor of the cottage with his sister dead. He decided it did, in practice, for the rest of his life, because he could not find another way to do what needed to be done. He managed the contradiction by being exceptionally careful about his own motivations, suspicious of himself in ways that made the management more careful than it otherwise would have been, and told almost no one that the contradiction was there. The summer, in the end, did not teach him that he was wrong about his own abilities. He was right about his abilities. It taught him that being right about your abilities does not mean you are right about what to do with them, and the distinction between those two things, which sounds clear when stated, but is very hard to hold on to when you are living inside it, became the fundamental challenge of the rest of his life. The First War, and what Dumbledore knew. Between 1970 and 1981, Albus Dumbledore watched a dark wizard rise inside the country he had spent his adult life serving. This was the second time he had watched this happen. The first time, he had been bound by the blood pact from acting against Grindelwald, and had spent decades managing the situation from a distance. This time there was no pact. This time the dark wizard was Tom Riddle, whom Dumbledore had known since Riddle was a child in an orphanage, and whose nature Dumbledore had understood earlier and more fully than perhaps anyone else. He had gone to the orphanage in 1938. Tom Riddle had been 11 years old, a thin, controlled, self-contained boy who had already demonstrated, to those children in the orphanage, unlucky enough to have drawn his attention, that his ability to make things happen extended to making things happen to people who had displeased him. He had known he was different for years. He had cultivated that difference as a source of power in an environment where power was otherwise scarce. Dumbledore sat in the boy's room in the orphanage and had the conversation in which he told Tom Riddle that magic was real, that what Riddle had been doing was magic, and that there was a school. He told the child what Hogwarts was. He watched the boy's face change as the information arrived, the way information does arrive in children who have been waiting for something that confirms their sense of themselves. He went back to Hogwarts, and he noted something in his assessment of young Riddle that he did not share with anyone. He noted that the boy was already extraordinary in an unsettling way. He noted that Riddle was already isolating himself emotionally in ways that suggested he did not view other people as ends in themselves, but as means to ends of his own. He noted that Riddle would arrive at Hogwarts with capabilities that other first years would not have, and a set of emotional orientations that would require careful attention. None of this was shared with the staff Riddle encountered through 7 years of schooling. The professors who taught him found him brilliant and charming and unusually capable, and did not, with one or two exceptions, find anything that alarmed them. The exceptions, including Horace Slughorn, noticed things they filed under impressive eccentricities, rather than early warning signs of what would eventually emerge. Nobody who taught Tom Riddle was told by Albus Dumbledore what Albus Dumbledore had seen in the orphanage. Why not? The strategic answer is that there was nothing actionable in what Dumbledore had observed. A child with worrying tendencies in an orphanage is not a dark wizard. You do not manage a potential future Dark Lord the way you would manage an active one. You watch, and you note, and you keep the observation available for when and if it becomes relevant. The less comfortable answer is that what Dumbledore had seen in that orphanage was also something he recognized. A brilliant young man with extraordinary ability who believed, at some level, that his exceptionalism placed him outside the ordinary constraints. The pattern was familiar. Tom Riddle grew up and became Lord Voldemort. He built a following of Death Eaters from among the Hogwarts students of his own generation and the generations that followed. He extended his reach into the Ministry. He killed people. He killed a great many people, and the people he killed were not only those who opposed him directly, but those who were in the wrong place, or had the wrong blood, or were made examples of, for reasons of theatre, as much as strategy. Dumbledore formed the Order of the Phoenix and organized resistance. He protected who he could and tried to gather intelligence and worked to limit the damage without being able to stop the source of it in the ways that might have mattered most. He told the Order members what he believed they needed to know for their specific roles. He kept the larger picture in his own head. He knew about the Horcruxes, not at first, and not completely, but by the end of the First War he had gathered enough evidence to be fairly certain that Voldemort had been making them. He knew, because he had thought carefully about Tom Riddle, and what Tom Riddle would do when presented with the knowledge that Horcruxes existed, that Riddle would have pursued them as the logical conclusion of everything his character had pointed toward. He began, slowly and with great care, to identify which objects might have been selected. He did not share this research comprehensively with the Order. He told specific people specific things, on a need-to-know basis, the way he managed everything. The possibility that Voldemort had protected himself in ways that conventional battle could not reach was not information Dumbledore distributed. Whether this was strategic caution or simply the habit of management that he could no longer turn off by that point is a question his character does not neatly resolve. After Voldemort's fall in 1981, when Harry Potter survived in the rubble of Godric's Hollow, and Voldemort's body was destroyed and the killing stopped, Dumbledore assessed the situation with the particular precision of someone who has been managing a crisis and needs to determine whether the crisis is over or only paused. He concluded, based on the evidence, that it was paused. He knew the Horcruxes were still out there. He knew that something of Voldemort had survived, though its nature and location were not yet clear. He placed Harry with the Dursleys. He arranged the blood protection enchantment that Lily Potter's sacrifice had made possible, tying it to the magic in Harry's aunt's blood, ensuring that as long as Harry called that house home, he would be protected from Voldemort, in the way that his mother's love had protected him at Godric's Hollow. He left a letter for Petunia Dursley that summarized the situation. He left Harry on a doorstep in November, in a blanket, with a scar on his forehead and a future full of things Dumbledore had already begun to plan for. He told nobody what he planned. He told Minerva McGonagall, who argued with him about leaving Harry with the Dursleys, that it was necessary. He did not tell her why it was necessary in the full sense, did not tell her about the enchantment and the blood protection and the specific mechanics that made the Dursley household the right place, rather than any number of other possible homes. He told her it was necessary and asked her to trust him. She trusted him. She always did. And Dumbledore walked away from Private Drive in the early morning light, pulling his put-outer from his pocket and restoring the street's illumination, and he went back to the task of preparing for the return of what he knew was not finished. The prophecy and both families. There are two families whose lives were shaped by Sybil Trelawney's prophecy in the Hogshead, and the secondary family, the Longbottoms, occupies a strange place in Dumbledore's record. When Voldemort chose to target the Potters rather than the Longbottoms, the choice was his to make. Both families fit the prophecy. Both had infants born as the seventh month died. Both sets of parents had thrice defied Voldemort. Either child could have been the one the prophecy described, and in choosing Harry, Voldemort was not following a certainty, but a guess, based apparently on the fact that Harry, as a half-blood like Voldemort himself, seemed more likely to carry the power the prophecy mentioned. Dumbledore knew both families were at risk. He extended what protection he could to both. The Fidelius charm under which the Potters eventually hid was arranged with his involvement. The advice he gave to both families about security and movement during the months when Voldemort was narrowing his focus was as thorough as he could make it. But after the Potters fell, after Harry survived, And after Neville Longbottom survived the war and grew up safely at home with his grandmother, the treatment of the two boys diverged in a way that reflected Dumbledore's certainty about which one the prophecy had chosen. He managed Harry's entire development with the precision of someone preparing a specific person for a specific thing. Neville he watched from a distance, kindly, as a gifted student who had been through his own family trauma, without the intense behind-the-scenes management that characterized his involvement with Harry. Whether this distinction was correct in every particular is debatable. The prophecy said that Voldemort would mark the one with the power as his equal, and Voldemort had done that. The mark was the scar. The choice had been made, and was therefore, in the logic of prophecy and magical history, the choice that locked in the trajectory. Neville was not the one, Harry was, and Dumbledore's resources were finite, but Neville's parents were in St. Mungo's Hospital. Alice and Frank Longbottom, Aurors who had defied Voldemort 3 times as the prophecy required, had been tortured into permanent incapacity by Bellatrix Lestrange and her associates in the immediate aftermath of Voldemort's fall. They were alive but not recoverable by any magic known at the time. Neville grew up visiting them at St. Mungo's, bringing his mother the Droobles blowing gum wrappers she pressed into his hand without knowing who he was. Dumbledore knew about the Longbottoms. He was not responsible for what had happened to them. He could not have prevented it without prior knowledge of the Lestranges' specific intentions in the days after Voldemort's fall. But the weight of Neville's situation, the child raised by a grandmother while his parents breathed but did not live, was not something Dumbledore could have been unaware of, and the degree to which the prophecy's implications, which required Dumbledore to invest his attention primarily in Harry, meant that Neville's circumstances were managed differently and with less intensity, is something that sits in the space between necessity and cost. Neville turned out fine in the end. He fought at the Battle of Hogwarts with remarkable courage. He killed Nagini, the final Horcrux, which was exactly the kind of action required at exactly the right moment. He became a herbology professor at Hogwarts and a respected member of Wizarding Society. But his parents are still in St. Mungo's, as far as the record indicates. They never recovered, and the prophecy that shaped Harry Potter's life, that Dumbledore managed with such precision, shaped Neville's life too, in the background, without the same level of personal investment from the man who had heard the prophecy first. This is not an accusation against Dumbledore so much as an observation about the nature of his management. He could not do everything. He chose what to prioritize. He was right about Harry being the one the prophecy described, and the cost of that rightness fell partly on the other boy, who existed in the prophecy's shadow without being its subject. The years of lessons, what Dumbledore was actually doing in Harry's 6th year. Harry Potter's 6th year at Hogwarts, the year of private lessons with Dumbledore in the headmaster's office, is generally understood as the year Dumbledore told Harry about the Horcruxes, and it was that, but it was also something more deliberate than the word told suggests. The structure of what Dumbledore shared with Harry in those lessons was not random. Each memory, each piece of evidence about Voldemort's history and the Horcruxes he had made, was selected and sequenced with a specific purpose. Dumbledore was not educating Harry the way a professor educates a student, giving them complete information and trusting them to sort it into a useful frame. He was building a specific understanding in a specific sequence, because the understanding needed to arrive in a particular order for the plan to work. He started with Tom Riddle. He wanted Harry to see Voldemort as a person before a monster. He wanted Harry to understand that the Dark Lord had been made rather than born that way, that the specific events of Riddle's childhood and adolescence had produced the specific shape of his ambitions and his methods. This was not just humane education. If Harry understood how Voldemort had been made, he would understand why the Horcruxes had been made, what objects Voldemort would have found symbolically meaningful enough to select for the purpose, what the logic of Voldemort's choices was. He moved through the memories in an order that built toward the number 6. Dumbledore was telling Harry there were 6 Horcruxes, while intending, at the same time, for Harry to eventually discover there was a 7th one. He was managing the revelation's timing precisely. He did not want Harry to know about the 7th Horcrux, because the 7th Horcrux was Harry himself, and the information was not useful until the right moment arrived. But he also took care in what he said about the 6th Horcrux. He told Harry he believed it was either the snake Nagini or an object he had not identified. He told Harry the Horcruxes they had confirmed were the diary, the ring, the locket, the cup, and the diadem. He told Harry this knowing that there was one more, one he could not tell Harry about yet, one that required the others to be destroyed before it could be addressed. The lessons had another purpose beneath the Horcrux information. Dumbledore was building Harry's trust in the plan, even while withholding the plan's most critical element. He was demonstrating, through the act of sharing so much, that he trusted Harry with difficult truths. He was creating a relationship in which Harry could believe that what Dumbledore told him was the truth, and all the truth. He was, in other words, laying the groundwork for Harry to trust the memories Snape would eventually give him, to receive what Snape showed him in the pensieve as genuine, as the continuation of what Dumbledore had been telling him all along. Harry walked into that pensieve in the Shrieking Shack and saw Dumbledore telling Snape that Harry had to die. He received this information with the particular calm of someone who had been slowly prepared for something without knowing what it was. His reaction, documented in those final hours before the Battle of Hogwarts ended, was not panic or refusal. It was the particular, quiet resolution of someone who understood what was required and found, to their own surprise, that they were able to provide it. That reaction was not accidental. Dumbledore had been building toward it for years. He told Harry more in the 6th year's lessons than he had ever told anyone. He was also, throughout those lessons, telling Harry's story to Harry in a way that shaped how Harry understood himself. He was giving Harry a version of events in which Harry's role was clear and his capability was trusted. He was treating Harry as someone worthy of the information, which was its own form of preparation. People told they are trusted tend to become more trustworthy. People shown they are believed in tend to become more capable of belief in themselves. The relationship between teacher and student in those lessons was the genuine article. Dumbledore cared about Harry, and Harry knew it, and the lessons were an expression of that care, in the particular form Dumbledore's care always took, the form of preparation, rather than comfort. He was not there to make Harry feel safe. He was there to give Harry what Harry needed to choose correctly when the time came. The love in that was real. The management of it was also real. Both things occupied the same space, without cancelling each other out. When Harry was in the forest, opening the snitch, turning the stone, calling his dead toward him, in the grey dawn light, he was carrying everything Dumbledore had given him, not just the stone, and not just the information, the years of being treated as someone capable of difficult things, the years of being told the truth in controlled quantities, by someone who clearly knew more than he said, but who was saying as much as he believed Harry could bear. The accumulated weight of a relationship built over 6 years by a man who knew from the beginning how it would have to end. He walked into the forest, and he was 17 years old, and he was brave, and the bravery was his own, and it was also partly something that Albus Dumbledore had spent years building into him. The letters he left. When Albus Dumbledore died, his will was brief and specific. He left the most powerful wand in the world to Harry Potter. He left a copy of a children's book to Hermione Granger. He left a Deluminator to Ronald Weasley. He left the golden snitch to Harry. He left the sword of Godric Gryffindor, and when the Ministry contested whether the sword was his to give, the sword found its own way to the people who needed it. The will was contested. The Ministry delayed the bequests for 31 days, while supposedly verifying their legitimacy, a delaying tactic that cost none of the intended recipients the opportunity to use what they had been given when they needed it most. This timing was precise. Not the Ministry's delay, which Dumbledore could not have controlled. The bequests themselves, which were crafted so that the usefulness of each item would arrive when needed, rather than immediately. He had also left other things, less formal, that do not appear in any will. He had left Snape with a set of tasks spread across the following year, and a dying headmaster's instruction to fulfill them. He had left Harry with a year of lessons whose value was not immediately clear from the outside, but whose internal logic was precise. He had left specific information inside the pensieve for Snape to access at the necessary moment. He had left, somewhere in the preparation, the specific enchantment on the snitch that would respond to Harry's touch and open to reveal what was inside. He had also left something for Aberforth, though it was not in the will. He had left his brother the knowledge, eventually communicated through Harry's own honesty in the Hog's Head during the Battle of Hogwarts preparation, that everything Albus had done had been in service of something he believed was right, that the years of management and the concealment and the separation between them had not been about indifference. Whether Aberforth found that knowledge sufficient was between the two of them. He left Neville Longbottom something too, though Neville did not know it was from him. He left Neville the environment at Hogwarts that had, despite its dangers, produced a person capable of pulling a sword from a hat at the moment the war required it. He left Neville 7 years of an education that included the particular quality of an institution that believed in its students, even when its headmaster's attention was elsewhere. He left Minerva McGonagall a school to run, which was less of a gift than it sounded in those first difficult months. He left her the particular challenge of being the person who came after the unrepeatable one, who had to maintain what he had built without the qualities he had personally brought to its maintenance. She managed this with the specific excellence of someone who had watched him for 40 years and understood, better than most, which parts of what he had done were transferable and which had been entirely his own. He left the wizarding world a story, not a complete one. A story with gaps that other people would have to fill in over the years that followed, some of them correctly and some of them not. Some of them with information he had prepared, and some with the information they constructed for themselves, because the prepared information was not available. A portrait in a headmaster's office, a tomb on the grounds, a grave in Godric's Hollow where his sister had been lying for nearly a century, and the long, slow work of a generation rebuilding in the peace that the plan had finally, after everything, produced. The portrait in the office. After a headmaster or headmistress of Hogwarts dies, an enchanted portrait of them is added to the collection on the office walls. The portraits are not the people themselves, a distinction that the portraits are generally aware of and that matters for understanding what they can and cannot do. They are complex magical impressions, capable of movement and speech, and something that looks like memory, but limited in ways that living people are not. They can advise, they cannot act, they can remember, within the scope of what the impression captured, they cannot grow. Albus Dumbledore's portrait appeared in the headmaster's office after his death on the astronomy tower. It was there when Severus Snape occupied the office as headmaster. It was there when Minerva McGonagall took the office after the Battle of Hogwarts. It was there when Harry Potter came to visit in the years that followed, and when Hermione Granger came to visit in her capacity as Minister for Magic, and when the many other people who had known the man came to look at the painted version of him. The portrait smiles. It offers advice when asked. It is warm and wise, and has the same quality of reassuring presence that the living man had, filtered through paint and enchantment into something that never quite ages, or needs sleep, or requires food. What the portrait does not do is confess. It does not volunteer the secrets that the man kept. It does not explain, unprompted, the summer, or the pact, or the ring, or the plan. It does not sit in the night when no one else is in the office and speak to the walls about what it carried. Whether this is because the portrait cannot do those things, or because even the enchanted impression of Albus Dumbledore maintains the habit of keeping certain things private, is a question that the portrait, if asked, would likely answer with a gentle deflection. Probably something about not burdening others with things that are better left at rest, probably accompanied by an offer of a lemon drop. There is something both comforting and melancholy about this. The portrait preserves the manner, but not the weight. It keeps the warmth and the wisdom and the careful lightness of tone, and it keeps the smile, and it keeps the patience with difficult questions. But it cannot carry what the man carried, because the enchantment that creates a portrait cannot capture suffering in the way that time and memory do in a living person. The portrait is the best representation of Albus Dumbledore that paint and magic can produce. And what it represents, faithfully, is a man who kept his secrets so well that even his own magical impression does not know exactly where they all are. On the question of the greater good, revisited, the phrase that Grindelwald adopted as the motto of his movement, inscribed at the entrance of Nurmengard, was one that Albus Dumbledore had helped him develop. For the greater good, the phrase appeared in their letters from that summer, in arguments they made to each other about why the domination of Muggles by wizards would benefit everyone, including the Muggles who would be dominated. History has associated the phrase entirely with Grindelwald, and Grindelwald certainly earned the association by the extremity of what he did in its name. But Dumbledore never fully separated himself from the phrase's logic, even after he separated himself from its application. His entire adult life was an exercise in managing people and information for what he believed was the greater good. which is to say for outcomes he assessed as better than the alternatives, on the basis of knowledge and reasoning most of the people involved did not share. He did not describe it this way. He would have resisted the description vigorously. But the structure of his approach, the calculation of who needed to know what in order to produce the best possible outcome, the willingness to impose costs on individuals for the benefit of a larger picture those individuals could not see, was not entirely different in structure from what Grindelwald had done, even if it was entirely different in degree and in the care taken with the people involved. Dumbledore was not Grindelwald. This is obvious and important. He did not build prison fortresses or kill people who disagreed with him or pursue domination for its own sake. The differences between them are real and vast. But the question of whether the approach he took, management from above, decisions made on behalf of people without their full participation, constituted a mild version of the same category of error, is one that history has not fully resolved, and that Dumbledore did not resolve for himself either. He came closest to saying so in the King's Cross conversation. He told Harry there that he had always been attracted to power, and that the ring was one of the clearest proofs of this. He told Harry that he had feared his own power because of what the summer had shown him about what he did with it. He told Harry that keeping himself from positions of formal power, declining the offer of Minister for Magic on multiple occasions, had been not only strategic, but an acknowledgement of his own limitation. He knew that power in his hands was not safe, not because he was bad, but because he had already demonstrated, at 17, what he did when he had it, and believed his vision was right. The acknowledgement of this, in King's Cross, is one of the most honest moments in the entire record. He said, in essence, "I knew I was dangerous and I tried to limit the damage I could do, and I am not sure I succeeded." He did not say it easily or comfortably. He said it in the particular tone of a very old man, accounting for himself to the person he had most benefited and most used. Harry's response, which was to ask if any of this was happening in his own head, and to hear Dumbledore answer that it was, but that this did not make it less real, was the answer the whole story had been building toward. The real and the imagined are not as separate as people assume. Plans made in privacy, kept in a single person's mind for decades, enacted through managed information and carefully calibrated bequests, are real in their effects, even if no one else ever saw them whole. What Dumbledore constructed was real, the plan was real, the love was real, the secrets were real. And the cost of the secrets was real as well, paid by Harry and Snape and Aberforth, and the people who worked with incomplete information for the better part of 2 decades, while Dumbledore held the complete picture in his own mind, and trusted, with the particular confidence that he always trusted himself despite everything, that he was handling it correctly. The wand that sat in the tomb. Between the autumn of 1945, when Dumbledore returned to Hogwarts with the Elder Wand, and the spring of 1998, when Harry Potter walked out of the Forbidden Forest alive, the Elder Wand sat in the headmaster's office at Hogwarts, and was used by its master with a restraint that the wand's history had never previously seen. Every previous owner of the Elder Wand had eventually used it for domination. Not all of them had sought global conquest, but all of them had eventually used the wand's power in the service of something close to it: control of their opponents, control of their environment, the demonstration of power on terms that others could not match. The wand's history was a chain of these demonstrations, each one eventually ending in the wand's loss, as someone more determined or more cunning found a way to beat the current master and claim the prize. Dumbledore used it to teach. He used it in the classroom, and in his office, and in the occasional duel, when a duel became unavoidable. He used it to set up protective enchantments of extraordinary complexity, to perform research into areas of magic that had not been previously explored, to do the administrative work of running a school that included occasional feats of magic too complex for a less accomplished wand. He used it to defeat Voldemort in their confrontation in the Ministry Atrium in 1996, which was not precisely domination, but was a demonstration that reminded everyone present of the gap between Dumbledore's ability and everyone else's. He did not use it to become Minister for Magic, which he had been offered and could certainly have secured if he had been willing to use the full weight of his magical and institutional authority. He did not use it to unilaterally end Grindelwald's campaign faster than he did, though that was partly the blood pact. He did not use it to impose his own vision of how the wizarding world should be run, though he clearly had views about this, and the opportunity to push them was present throughout his tenure as headmaster. What he used it for was the plan. The long, slow, careful plan that involved preparing a boy and managing a double agent and destroying Horcruxes one at a time, and ensuring that the conditions for Voldemort's final defeat were created without Voldemort being able to perceive them being created. The Elder Wand was, in Dumbledore's hands, an instrument of exactly the kind of power it was most suited to, the power to do things that other wands could not do, in the service of a goal that required extreme precision over a very long time. He never told anyone what it was. Not Snape, who knew more about Dumbledore's thinking than anyone, and who might have found the information useful. Not Harry, even in the 6th year when he shared so much else. Not the Ministry, which was periodically concerned about the location and status of powerful magical objects. The Elder Wand's identity was his private knowledge, shared with him by Grindelwald at the moment of defeat, or extracted from him by whatever means Dumbledore had available, and maintained as strictly private for the rest of his life. His decision to tell Harry about the Deathly Hallows in the end was communicated through the bequest of the Tale of the Three Brothers to Hermione, which he apparently expected Hermione to connect to the real objects, which he expected would lead the trio to the conversation with Xenophilius Lovegood, which would introduce the Hallows as a concept, which would give Harry enough to work with when the remaining pieces arrived. It was the most elaborately indirect method of sharing information available, and it was characteristic. He wanted Harry to find the Hallows as a concept without being told they were real, or that Dumbledore had possessed one of them. He wanted Harry's mind to work on the problem without the short circuit of being handed the answer. This was, again, both pedagogically sound and a way of withholding direct credit for how much of the infrastructure of the solution Dumbledore had built. What Aberforth knew, and when Aberforth Dumbledore is an important figure in any account of his brother's secrets, because Aberforth was the one person with access to information that Albus could not control from within the relationship. Aberforth had been there in 1899. He had seen Grindelwald. He had seen what his brother became that summer, and he had witnessed the aftermath firsthand. He carried his own version of the secrets, the Dumbledore family's version, and he had lived for decades with his own relationship to what those secrets meant. He had also spoken at Ariana's death, in public, at a moment of extreme grief and anger. He had broken Albus's nose at the funeral, which is not a metaphor for anything except what it was. A younger brother's grief expressed in the most immediate physical language available. The relationship between the brothers was broken by that summer, in ways that were not repaired until Aberforth opened the passageway for Harry Potter during the final battle. What Aberforth told Harry, in the Hog's Head, in the hours before the Battle of Hogwarts, was the truth, as Aberforth understood it. He told Harry about Ariana. He told Harry about Grindelwald. He told Harry about what Albus had been like that summer, occupied and careless, and what had followed. He told Harry, in terms that were not gentle, that Dumbledore had a habit of getting other people killed for his plans, and that Harry should consider whether his own position in those plans was one he had actually chosen. This was not an unfair criticism. Aberforth had watched his brother's tendency to manage things for the greater good from the closest possible vantage point, having experienced it in its first form. He had seen Ariana die because Albus had been too occupied with Grindelwald and philosophy to give the summer's management the attention it required. He had spent his life since then in the shadow of the great headmaster who emerged from that summer's wreckage, and the shadow had been longer than most people knew. What Aberforth did not have, and what he told Harry openly, was faith. He did not believe, by the time of the final battle, that Dumbledore's plan was going to work. He believed, with the particular cynicism of a man who had seen too many of his brother's plans up close, that Harry was going to be the next person damaged or destroyed by the management of something Albus had decided was necessary. He said so directly. He offered Harry the alternative of leaving, of not walking into the battle, of choosing life over the plan. Harry chose the plan. This was not because Harry had not heard what Aberforth said, but because Harry had, by that point, developed his own reasons for believing in what he was doing that were separate from Dumbledore's authority. He believed in the people around him. He believed that stopping Voldemort was worth the risk. He made the choice that Dumbledore had hoped he would make, and he made it freely, as Dumbledore had also hoped. But what Aberforth said to him in that pub stays with the record. The person who knew Dumbledore most intimately, who had no reason to maintain the image, and every reason to complicate it, told Harry that the plan was the same kind of thing that had gotten people killed before, that the greater good had a cost that people other than Dumbledore paid, that the faith placed in Albus Dumbledore by a generation of witches and wizards deserved more scrutiny than it usually received. He was not entirely wrong. He was also there in the final battle, fighting, opening the passage, staying. He fought for the same things his brother's plan had been designed to protect, for different reasons, or in spite of reasons, out of the particular stubbornness of someone who believes in people, even when he has stopped believing in plans. In the end, both Dumbledores contributed to the outcome. The one who built the plan and died before he saw it finish. The one who doubted the plan and fought anyway. The relationship between those two contributions is the relationship between the brothers, unresolved and productive, and never exactly clean. The night he left Harry on the doorstep. There is one night in the full scope of these secrets that has not received the attention it deserves, and it is the night of November the 1st, 1981. Albus Dumbledore walked up to number 4 Privet Drive in the early hours of that morning, sat on a low wall, waited, and then watched Rubeus Hagrid arrive on a flying motorbike with a sleeping infant secured to his chest. He watched Hagrid hand the baby to Minerva McGonagall, who had been watching the house all day in cat form and had opinions about the wisdom of leaving a child with the Dursleys that she expressed clearly and at some length. He listened. He understood. He held the sleeping baby for a moment and looked at the scar on his forehead. He put Harry on the doorstep. He placed a letter for Petunia Dursley beside him, tucked under the rugs. He performed the enchantment that would tie Lily's sacrifice to Petunia's blood and make the house a protected space. He put his put-outer away. He walked down the street. The record does not describe what he felt in that moment. Minerva's feelings are documented. She was uncomfortable and said so. Hagrid's feelings are documented. He cried, and the crying was simply grief for the Potters and for the child being left, felt with the fullness that Hagrid brought to every feeling. Dumbledore's are not. What can be inferred is something about the weight of what he was doing. He was placing a child who had just lost his parents, a child who was barely over a year old, with a family that he had reason to believe would not provide warmth or love or the specific kind of magical education that a wizard child needs. He was doing this because he believed the blood protection required it, and the belief was sound, and the plan depended on it. He was also making a choice about what Harry's childhood would be. He was choosing a version of Harry's life that would be defined by absence, absence of parents, absence of the magical world, absence of the knowledge of his own history, until he was 11 years old, and Hagrid arrived to tell him. He was choosing a Harry who would arrive at Hogwarts without the specific kind of entitlement that a boy raised, knowing he was famous in a world that celebrated him might carry. He was choosing a Harry who would be humble because he had been made humble, who would be hungry for belonging because he had been kept from it. Whether this was strategic, whether Dumbledore reasoned that the specific deprivation of Harry's childhood would produce the specific character he needed, or whether it was simply the best available option, given the constraint of the blood protection, is something the record does not settle. Dumbledore said, in the King's Cross conversation, that he had watched Harry from a distance all those years, and had been proud, that he had believed in Harry, and cared about him, that his decision not to intervene in the conditions of Harry's upbringing had not been made carelessly. But he also acknowledged that he had made mistakes, that he had delayed telling Harry things that might have been better shared earlier, that the childhood he had arranged for Harry had not been kind, and that the unkindness had not been entirely necessary. On the doorstep of number 4 Privet Drive, in the small hours of November the 1st, Albus Dumbledore placed a sleeping child whose parents had just died, and walked away down a residential street in Surrey, with his hat pulled down, and his long robes inappropriate for the neighbourhood, and his heart whatever it was. He did not look back. The record does not mention it if he did, but there is a version of him that looked back once, from the end of the street, at the small bundle on the doorstep of the ordinary house, and understood in that glance the full weight of what he was beginning, the weight of the plan, the weight of Harry's future, the weight of everything that would have to be managed and arranged and kept back, and finally, in a forest in the early morning of the last battle, released. He kept that weight too. He kept all of it. The tools he built for other hands. Every chapter in the story of Albus Dumbledore's secrets eventually connects to an object, Not because objects are the point, but because a man who could not share his secrets verbally had a habit of encoding them in things. The mirror of Erised, behind its public function as a device for showing the observer their deepest desire, carries the imprint of Dumbledore's thinking about the Philosopher's Stone and the particular kind of wanting that he distrusted most. The pensieve holds what could not be spoken. The deluminator, the instrument he built himself and left to Ron Weasley, does something beyond its stated purpose. The deluminator is publicly a light-collecting device, the tool Dumbledore used to remove and return streetlight as he walked down Privet Drive on that November night. It is small, silver, shaped like a cigarette lighter, and it did belong to Dumbledore for years before he left it to Ron. The modification he made to it, at some point before his death, gives it an additional function that the bequest did not explain. When Ron Weasley left Harry and Hermione in the middle of their Horcrux hunt, in the winter of 1997, driven out of the tent by the Locket's malice and his own exhaustion, and the specific pain of watching Harry and Hermione in the shared intimacy of their long friendship, he spent several weeks alone before the Deluminator led him back. He heard Hermione's voice coming out of the device as a sound, and he followed the sound into a light that entered his chest and led him to where the others were. Dumbledore built this. He anticipated, at some level, that Ron might break. Not because Ron was weak, but because the specific configuration of Ron's insecurities and the Locket's power and the isolated conditions of the hunt made it a real possibility. He built, into the small silver instrument, a way for Ron to come back to the people he needed to come back to. He did not explain this to Ron. He left it in the will and trusted that the mechanism would operate when it was needed. This is the quality of Dumbledore's planning that is hardest to hold in a single thought. He was planning for the failure modes. He was anticipating the moments when the people carrying the plan would falter, and he was building in corrections without telling anyone that the corrections were there. The plan was resilient because he had built redundancies into it, and the redundancies were invisible to the people they were meant to serve. Harry's snitch held the resurrection stone. The stone would let Harry call his dead to walk beside him into the forest and face Voldemort without flinching. Dumbledore anticipated that Harry would need something to steady him in that final walk, something beyond his own courage or his love for the living, and he built the provision for it into a golden ball, inherited from his first Quidditch match, carried for years without knowing what was inside. The tale of the three brothers, left to Hermione, was the key to understanding the Hallows. Dumbledore knew that Hermione would read it, and Hermione would connect it, and Hermione would share what she found with the others. He knew that the chain of deduction from the children's story to the real Hallows was within Hermione's capability, and that she would pursue it with the thoroughness she brought to everything. He left them tools he did not explain, trusting that they would use the tools correctly because he had spent years observing them, and he was confident in what he had observed. The confidence was not vanity exactly. It was the specific confidence of someone who had paid very close attention for a very long time. He had watched Harry and Ron and Hermione through 6 years of school. He had seen how they responded to pressure, and to each other, and to loss. He had built his provisions around what he knew of them as individuals. This is one of the genuinely remarkable things about the plan. It was not generic. It was built for these specific people. The enchantment on the snitch was built for Harry's specific history with that particular ball. The voice in the Deluminator was built for Ron's specific anchor in the people he loved. The book given to Hermione was chosen for Hermione's specific habit of taking books seriously and following their implications wherever they led. The plan was tailored to the people executing it in a way that required decades of observation to enable. He could not have told them this while he was alive. Saying, "I have built these things specifically for you because I have been watching you closely and I know you well enough to anticipate your failure modes," is not something that can be received comfortably by a person of any age, much less by teenagers under enormous pressure. He expressed it through the objects instead. He left them things that would help them be who they were. The love encoded in those objects is real, even if it is also management. The two are not, in Dumbledore's character, separable. He loved Harry enough to spend years thinking about what Harry would need in the worst moment of the plan. The expression of that love was a snitch with a stone inside it and a dead man's memories and a long walk through a dark forest. It was not comfortable love or demonstrative love, but it was love with the particular substance of someone who spent years thinking about what you needed and building it for you. while you were looking elsewhere. He took the knowledge that he had done this to his grave. The objects did the explaining afterward, as he had intended. The long silence between the brothers. In the years between 1999 and the period of Voldemort's Second War, Albus Dumbledore ran the Hog's Head in Hogsmeade, and his brother ran Hogwarts, and they did not speak often. They were not estranged in the formal sense of never seeing each other, because Hogsmeade was close to Hogwarts, and the wizarding world is not so large that you can avoid someone you share it with indefinitely. But the closeness was managed, maintained at a distance that felt safe to both of them, which was primarily the distance that Aberforth required, and that Albus respected, by not pushing for more. Albus had his brother's telephone number, so to speak. He had access to Aberforth, and he did not use it more than the situation required. This was part respect and part cowardice, in the proportion that those two things are always mixed when someone knows a conversation needs to happen, and keeps not having it. The conversation that needed to happen was the one about Ariana, about who had cast the fatal spell, about whether either of them would ever know for certain, and what it meant to carry the uncertainty for decades, and whether there was any version of the event that both brothers could live with. Albus had never initiated this conversation, and Aberforth, who had his own version of grief management that involved never talking about things, and keeping goats and dispensing minimal hospitality to customers he did not particularly like, had not initiated it either. They had talked around it. They had talked at the edges of it during the period of Voldemort's second rise, when Aberforth agreed to keep the passage open from the Hog's Head into Hogwarts, and to provide a kind of logistical support to the resistance that was not the same as fighting, but was not nothing. Aberforth was there in the final battle. He came through the passage and he fought. His reasons were his own, connected less to his brother's plan than to the people in the school, and the things he had seen, and the stubborn refusal to stand aside that had defined him since childhood. The conversation about Ariana happened, eventually, in the form of what Harry told Aberforth in the pub. Harry told Aberforth that Albus had regretted the summer, had understood what it cost, had spent his life trying to be different than he had been in those weeks. Whether this constituted the conversation Aberforth needed to have with his brother is something only Aberforth could answer. He was there at the end. He kept the passage open. He did not come back afterward to say what he thought of his brother's choices, or of his brother's plan, or of the outcome. He tended the bar. He fed the goats. He kept his own counsel. This is, in many ways, the most Dumbledore thing that Aberforth did. He processed privately. He arrived at whatever conclusions he arrived at, without making them available to examination. He kept going, and he kept his grief internal, and he did not explain himself to the people around him who might have found the explanation illuminating. Whatever the brothers shared, in addition to blood and history, and the specific damage of that summer, they shared this: the conviction that the interior of a person is their own, and that what they carry is theirs to carry, and that speaking about it does not necessarily make it easier, or more true, or more manageable. The conviction that getting on with things is not the same as not feeling them. Albus learned this early and built it into the structure of his character. Aberforth learned it in the same summer and expressed it by being the kind of man who ran a rough pub in a small village and answered questions with the minimum possible words and did not let anyone get close enough to ask the ones that actually mattered. They were, in the end, more similar than either of them would have been comfortable acknowledging, different in ability, and in presence, and in the kind of mark they left on the world. But in the thing underneath, the determination to hold their grief, and their shame, and their love, as private property, they were recognizably brothers. What sleep carries? Tonight, if you have been here all the way through, if the voice has carried you from Godric's Hollow in 1899 to the Forbidden Forest in 1998, and through the decades between them, you have spent time with a man who was extraordinary and limited in the specific way that the most interesting people always are. The limitation and the exceptionalism were not separable. The things that made him capable of building the plan that ended 2 wars were the same things that made him unable to share the plan with the people it affected most. The love that built the snitch enchantment and the deluminator modification was the same love that sat in a headmaster's office for 7 years and never said the complete truth about what Harry was and what Harry would need to do. There is something about the dark and the quiet that makes these kinds of stories available in a way they are not in daylight. In daylight, The question of whether Dumbledore was right or wrong about his secrets feels like something that should have a clear answer. In the dark, it feels less like a judgment and more like something to hold and turn gently. Right and wrong are in there, but they are not the whole of it. Love is in there. Shame is in there. The particular quality of a person who was shaped by a single summer into someone who could never again be certain that his most powerful impulses were trustworthy. He was afraid of himself, not in ways he discussed, but in ways that shaped every major choice he made for the rest of his life. The caution was real. The fear behind the caution was real. The summer had taught him that his certainty was not reliable, and so he became a man who doubted himself precisely when he was most certain, which is an exhausting and necessary quality for someone with as much power as he had. He took all of it to his grave: Ariana's face, Grindelwald's voice, the weight of the ring on his cursed hand, the knowledge of what Snape had agreed to carry, the specific texture of what it felt like to know what Harry was, and to not tell him, the conversation he never had with Aberforth, or had only in fragments, about the question they both carried. He is buried at Hogwarts, in the marble tomb. The Elder Wand is with him, as Harry placed it, giving the wand back to the man who had used it, with more restraint than any previous owner. The grounds around the tomb are the grounds where generations of students had played and studied and grown and gone out into a wizarding world that existed, in the form it took, after 1998, partly because of what Dumbledore had arranged. It is enough to lie with, in the quiet, a man and his secrets and the world they helped to save, the woman in a Godric's Hollow churchyard who never grew up, the brother behind the bar who never completely forgave and never completely stopped caring, the boy who walked into the forest and came back out. Let these things rest now, as you rest. They are old stories by any measure that matters, settled into the stone of a school on a Scottish hillside and into the air of a country that moved on. The war ended, the people who survived it lived, and Albus Dumbledore, in paint and enchantment on the headmaster's office wall, keeps the hours. He says nothing about the summer. He never will. That is who he was. That and everything else. Let it carry you now into whatever silence comes next, and rest there, and when morning comes you will carry a little more of him than you did before. The decisions he made for others. There is a particular kind of moral question that only arises when someone is both genuinely good and genuinely powerful. Ordinary people, ordinary goodness, does not create this problem. If a person of moderate ability and moderate understanding makes decisions on behalf of others without consulting them, the decisions are limited in their effect. But when a person of Dumbledore's ability and breadth of understanding does the same thing, the decisions shape the lives of people who never knew they were being shaped. He decided where Harry Potter would grow up. He decided what Harry would be told and when. He decided how Snape would spend the remaining decades of his life. He decided, in practical terms, how the wizarding world's most important war would be fought, and who would bear what costs in its fighting. He made these decisions from a position of genuine knowledge and genuine care, and they were largely correct decisions, in the sense that they produced outcomes that were better than the realistic alternatives, and he made them alone. The philosophical problem here is not new. It is the problem that arises whenever someone with the capacity to see clearly what others cannot see acts on that clarity without the consent of those affected. You can call it paternalism, which is the mild version, or you can call it something with sharper edges, depending on the stakes involved and the degree to which consent was possible. In Dumbledore's case, some of the decisions could not practically have been made with the consent of those affected. You cannot ask an infant where he should grow up. You cannot ask a 17-year-old boy whether he consents to be told that he is a Horcrux in the time frame that revelation would allow. But some decisions could have been made differently. He could have told Harry more, earlier, and trusted that Harry's character was strong enough to bear it. He assessed otherwise, and he may have been right, and the question of whether he was right will never be fully settled, because the alternative was not run. He could have shared the shape of the plan with the Order of the Phoenix, which was an organization of adults who had signed up to risk their lives for the cause. He did not, and the cost was paid in grief and in missing information that affected how the war's participants managed themselves in its critical months. He could have spoken to Aberforth. He did not do that either, or not enough, and the cost there was paid in a long estrangement between two men who had shared the most defining experience of both their lives, and processed it separately, for the better part of a century. The decisions were not made from cruelty. They were made from a combination of strategic calculation and the deep personal habit of keeping his most important thoughts and feelings unavailable to anyone else. The habit was not a flaw in the way that deliberate cruelty is a flaw. It was more like a scar, the remaining evidence of a wound, changed in texture from the surrounding material, present in ways that shaped everything around it, without being the same as the wound itself. The summer was the wound, the habit was the scar, and Albus Dumbledore spent a century being very careful about how much he let people see of either. In the end, what he built was a world that survived. Not a perfect world, not one without its own compromises and corruptions, and the ordinary human capacity for damage, but a world where the specific horror of Voldemort's rule was ended, and where the people who had come through it could live and rebuild and raise children whose lives would be different from the lives of their parents. He built that world partly through the decisions he made on other people's behalf, and partly through the decisions he made on his own behalf, and partly through the actions of people he had trusted enough to prepare. The secrets he took to his grave were the private record of how all of that came to be. They were the parts of the construction that nobody else was allowed to see while the construction was happening. They were the scaffolding that got removed after the building was complete. The building stands, the scaffolding is gone, and what remains of Albus Dumbledore, in portraits and in memories, and in the lives of the people he shaped, does not include the scaffolding's full architecture. That went with him, as he intended, as he had always intended. Rest now. The story is told. The night is deep, and the silence is full of something that might be peace, or might be the particular quiet that settles over the spaces where grief has finally been given room to breathe. Either way, it is yours for the hours that remain. Close your eyes. Let the summer at Godric's Hollow recede back into history, where it has always been waiting. Let the old headmaster have his portrait and his tomb and his private thoughts. He kept them well enough, all those years. He can keep them a little longer. Sleep now.